Welcome to tonight's episode. We're doing something a little bit different for our YouTube channel as well as our Facebook Live. We're inviting people in to kind of follow up on a discussion that happened earlier. I have a special guest with me. You may have seen him. In fact, I have high schoolers who take my class at a private school here in South Carolina who already knew Captain Deadpool before he even was brought up in class. And so we have him. He had done a statement against another apologist, and that apologist asked a group of us to come on and respond to him. So we did. And then Captain Deadpool also brought a panelist on, and that group jumped in and responded to us. And there may have been some miscommunications or misunderstandings of each other. And I'm one of those people where I don't like 4-on-4. I'd rather have a one-on-one, and I feel like I could be friendly enough to do that. And it seems like Ricky or Captain Deadpool seemed like he was definitely going to be interested in a one-on-one. We talked on Facebook Messenger, and so here we are. We're going to figure we'll just walk through this and talk about it ourselves. And I'm going to go ahead and bring him on. Captain Deadpool, thanks for joining us. If you would tell us a little bit about yourself. Obviously, we don't share the same opinion, but in addition to that, tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of what you enjoy doing.
I was a evangelical Christian for 15 years, and I wanted to be a pastor or Bible scholar or whatever the Lord would lead me. So I went to Bible college. I graduated with a degree in biblical theology, and along the way, I came out the other end with more questions than I had answers. So at some point, I stopped considering myself a Christian, but I didn't stop believing in God until a little bit later after that. And now I make content on TikTok, and I had a video unexpectedly go viral talking about my story very briefly. And I had a bunch of people ask follow-up questions from that, and I would just answer those questions. And that's kind of what I've been doing ever since.
Yeah, and I saw that one actually, and I think my wife actually bombed your TikTok the other night and incidentally informed your wife about this conversation tonight. I was like, way to go, Claire. Like
that's right. I forgot about that.
So she was checking out kind of what you do in content and so forth. But I think one thing that you and I would agree on is that there are issues within Christianity or even potential issues within Scripture that cause anybody to have to pull back and say, okay, there has to be a battle in your mind at some point. And I think there's a lot of Christians. I've heard people say this in Christianity, like, oh, well, I don't struggle. I just believe what the Scripture says. It's like, oh, come on, man. Like live in the real world with the rest of us here. Like there are major conflicts of crisis that I even went through. Just kind of give you a little bit about me. I remember, and I've told the story multiple times, I didn't touch the book of 2 Peter. I didn't preach, teach, or read from it for well over a year and a half, because I struggled.
I know where this is going.
So I really struggled with it. After one individual, a college professor at Dallas Theological Seminary, sent me something. He said, hey, just chase this thought and see where it lands. And I spent the next 6 months studying that thought and actually came to a different position that a lot of Christians have on 2 Peter. I do believe it's canon in Scripture, which I know we differ on that one. But I did come to a totally different way of explaining and looking at it historically and trying to understand the writer and what he said about himself, while also seeing the differences with 1 Peter and being able to actually explain that. And it changed the whole way I looked at things. But I don't regret the year and a half of crisis. I don't regret it. I think it was the best thing that ever happened to me. It made me think different. It made me react different. But I do realize there are people that struggle, and many that can relate with your story. Clearly, if they're writing you through the TikTok video, they're relating with you. So I can understand the struggle. It seems to be a regular thing. What would you say contributed to the major portion of, like, what started your path to go, okay, I just can't buy into this anymore? Was it a church service, or was it maybe a disposition or a claim that you heard in church that nobody could ever answer? What kind of started that trend, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, it was in Bible college. Again, I was majoring
Okay.
in biblical theology. And it was a combination of things, but a couple of big ones that stand out is one, learning that the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses. And this was not a like liberal college. This was I went to the University of Valley Forge. This is a sister college of Liberty University.
Gotcha. Okay.
So this is an Assemblies of God affiliated church, which believed in the doctrine of inerrancy, more or less. As soon as I heard that, I was like, And then they presented like the arguments around those. And I also, Bible college is where I first learned about the Epic of Gilgamesh. And they were like, yeah, this story is much older than Genesis. But Genesis is the real one. I was like, how? Hold on. That Bible college is where I learned about Isaiah chapter 8, where the word for virgin actually means young woman. In the Hebrew, so like those are the
seven,
things.
chapter 7, yeah.
Chapter 7, yeah. 8 is where the child was born. But yeah, so like all these things that you don't hear in church. And I'd been going to church for 10-ish years at that point, usually multiple times a week. And I was reading my Bible pretty much every day. And so I go to Bible college and hear all these things I'd never heard before, and
It's a lot.
I'd go and look into them myself. Yeah, so it kind of piles up, and eventually I was just like, there's a lot of very muddy information here, and at some point, the faith aspect of it just is not adequate enough to reconcile all the different issues that you're faced with.
That's a good, and what's interesting, just hearing you talk about those things, I became aware of those things as well. Like the Epic of Gilgamesh, I was excited I was like, what is that?
Yeah.
And the different concepts, the different ideas of even the Isaiah, all the things you mentioned, I sit here as a Christian and I go, I understand why anybody would struggle with some of this stuff. Now, what's interesting is how you and I have gone in different directions as to our views on those things and what that did to us. But nonetheless, it's really neat to hear somebody say, you know what, I was introduced to these things and it changed my perspective on these things. And I would say that no matter what, you and I landed completely different on what we assess in the end. But both of us can sit here and say the information changed the way we think about the Bible. The information changed the way we think about history, because I don't look at things the same way. Again, I still land with scripture where you wouldn't, but I can actually say I have a broader view of the ancient Near East. Like it changed. You cannot read these ancient texts, some of which are older than when the Torah was written, and say they don't have any bearing or helping you understand or see or expand on your understanding of the ancient Near East at the time. And it helps you understand why certain writers of scripture said certain things or mentioned certain locations. Like, I think the greatest danger in Christianity is withheld knowledge. See, I grew up in a movement more so where the idea was keep everybody in a bubble. Now, I'm not saying my parents. I'm speaking in the churches I was in, some of the even the undergrads and situations like it's let's just teach the Bible. And I'm fine with that, but it's really a narrow view where you're not seeing the Bible in light of history. You're not seeing it in light of archaeology. You're not seeing it in light of science. And so to me, one of the greatest eye-opening things was to look outside that bubble for the first time and start saying, oh, wow, look what science is producing. Look what archaeology has dug up. Look what history has written in addition to what we do know. And I've seen a lot of complementarian from that. And I know that you would differ on a lot of that and say, well, I've actually seen opposition and contradiction, et cetera. And that's part of what we're talking about today, right? I mean, that's part of our discussion specifically is about the Gospels. And so let's kind of like clarify something, because you said we misunderstood you, and I do not want to misrepresent you. And if I did, I apologize. You mentioned in John 21, manuscript P66, which I didn't spend as much on P66 in my doctoral work as I did P75. But you mentioned in P66 the potentiality of 21 being added later. It sounds like what you were saying was at the end of your explanation, your follow-up video, that you do realize there's sections, fragmented verses of 21 in P66. Can you clarify that? And if I'm wrong, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, my point in saying that was that the first manuscript that mentions John 21 is P66. And even then it's cut off, but it's dated to the earliest date, because there's the dating on P66 is all over the place. All over the place. But like the earliest estimate puts it around the time of Eusebius, which is the first person to which is the one who says that 20 is the end of the chapter, like I mentioned in the video.
You mean you mean Tertullian?
Tertullian, sorry. Yes, Tertullian.
Yeah. I would agree. I would say that P66 is probably around 175. If it's between 150 and 200, it's probably somewhere in the middle there. So you did acknowledge that it actually contained it. Okay. So, well, I
you can go back and watch the video. I even put the references on the screen.
I misunderstood that, and I apologize. Yeah. That was
all 4 of you did. Come on now.
Hey, listen, I can't speak for the other 3. I'm only telling you what I did.
It's all good.
Now, going back to the Tertullian claim, though, one of the things I think it was Eric that brought up from Testified, he had brought up that Tertullian quoted often. I say often, we can definitively say 3 times. There's a 4th and a 5th that are potential allusions, but explicitly there's 3. So would you have potentially recognized that Tertullian was also familiar with the last chapter?
Hang on. I did not pull up my notes.
Eric gave the references, and I probably should have.
He said, there's all these allusions to it, but in the verse I quoted, he said, now, by the way, real quick, this is not a hill I'm willing to die on. If chapter 21 is originally in there, fine. That's not going to sway me. I was just pointing out, hey, this is one of the potential problems on top of all the others. There's this idea that this verse was added later. There's also the idea that John 1:1, or the first chapter of John, or at least 1 through 14 or something, was added later, but we don't have to go into that. I think good.
And I'll try to find it. I have it down here. I guess I should have pulled up because Eric had sent me kind of a list of what was going on beforehand, but so kind of talking about the prologue and the epilogue there, because that's pretty much what we're talking about, John 1:1, or the very end there, the prologue, epilogue. Could it be that Tertullian was describing the end of the narrative text that would have been a conclusion, probably from verse 15 and following of chapter 1 all the way up to chapter 20, chapter 21 itself, and that he recognized the style of John as having the pretty common epilogue at the end there, and it would have been distinct, or do you see that those were additions? I know you said that you weren't willing to die on that hill, but the addition part of it.
Yeah, I see. Like I said in the video, chapter 20 is a very fitting end to a gospel. It ends even smoother than the original ending of Mark. It ends with he performed many other miracles. There's not enough paper in the world to write all the miracles that he did, you guys. It's pretty much, I'm paraphrasing a little bit.
It's like the Message Bible version.
Right. But yeah, then it sounds like, it sounds like at the end, but then he's like, and then Peter goes fishing. And the entirety of chapter 21 is pretty much all about Peter. So it's not a crazy thing to think that maybe a later scribe came around and was like, I want to add more authenticity or more authority to this by putting Peter in there. Because it's like read 21. It's all about Peter, which is weird. No other chapter in John is like that. Peter's not that big of a deal in John, except for the last chapter. Why is that? And in the end, it concludes, this is the testimony of the one, or this is the writing. We are writing this. I can't remember the word now. I should have pulled it up. Yeah, it says, this is the testimony of the one who was saying these things, right? So I think the author of 21 is, we know his testimony is true. So I think the Indian 21 is saying, yeah, this is Peter. Peter said these things. So that's how we know it's true, because people knew who Peter was. So that would add a lot of weight to the claims made in John to do that from a scribal perspective.
Yeah, and so there's part of that where I wouldn't actually differ with, and I don't know if that was caught on to the discussion you had. I think Pat was kind of alluding to. I think he was catching on to where I was going with my perspective of John's gospel. So I happen to believe that John's gospel was actually a group gospel. I don't think it was just John by himself, and the reason I mention that is because the Muratorian fragment actually explains that Andrew was a part of the scenario. Some of the other leaders that were still surviving in Ephesus at that time came and actually went to John and said, "Hey, you should tell your story." And he said, "Well, let's fast and pray about it for 3 days." And then Andrew comes back and says, "Hey, that same night," it says that Andrew had revealed to him that John should narrate. And I always emphasize this when I mention John's gospel. John should narrate, not write, narrate all the things in his own name as they, and I always demonstrate the Muratorian fragment has the plural in the pronouns there. They called them to mind. And I think that's one of the things that we find different about John that's different from the rest of the gospels is the we and us and our in chapter 1 in the prologue. And then you see the we and us again at the epilogue, but only in the beginning and only the ending. And it's almost like John had this following. John had this group of apostles that were still surviving. Andrew explicitly named there in the Muratorian fragment, and then these other leaders. And they wanted him to tell his story before he died. And they motivated this idea that he would do this, but they wanted him to narrate it, not write it. And I kind of mentioned in the video that the complexity of the writing of John is the most simple in its vocab, but complex in its narration. I do not believe John the Apostle personally, and I got flack for this, and I continue to get flack for this. I don't think John the Apostle had the education level to write a narrative that way. But one of the things that I tried to reconcile when I studied the Johannine writings is that you have a simple vocab, enough to where first-year Greek students go to John's Gospel to learn Greek. And then you have this complex philosophical layout of a writing within that simple vocab. And what would make sense to me is if John is in Ephesus, which is where these documents say it was, he would have the opportunity to have some of the greatest scribes. I think is it the Anti-Marcionite Prologue? I'm trying to remember if it's the Anti-Marcionite Prologue that says that Papias was one of the scribes. I'd have to go back and look. But they're even saying that Papias was probably one of the scribes. Not sure if that's true or not, but he had scribes available to him to write. Papias clearly could write an entire treatise. He wrote 5 volumes. I mean, he clearly could write physically. So maybe he was one of the scribes there for him. But to me, it's interesting that Andrew's mentioned there. And then you come into John chapter 1, and the first 2 disciples on the scene are Andrew and the unnamed disciple. And it is Andrew who goes and gets Peter and introduces Peter to Jesus. And then we find out that that unnamed disciple in chapter 1 ends up being the disciple who Jesus loved, who ends up being the one at the very end of the epilogue that says, "This is the one writing this to you." He's that hidden disciple that whole time. But it's interesting, the 2 people in the Muratorian fragment are the ones that are mentioned at the very beginning of the narrative. And you find that Peter is actually not the first apostle that meets Jesus. Because if you just go by Mark, Peter's the first name in the gospel of the apostles. And it says Peter and his brother Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter. So it's like starts with Peter, mentions Andrew, but then it comes right back and ends on Peter. So that's kind of part of the inclusio eyewitness that Bauckham talks about, but he's not the only one that brings that out. But is that if a writer is going to write to give you kind of a perspective of who's giving you the information, it's going to be the first name in the narrative and the last name in the narrative, whereas Mark starts with Mark, or starts with Peter, and then it ends with tell my brothers and Peter. So the book ends with Peter's name, whereas John, it does bring up Peter, like you mentioned in chapter 21 there, but the last person who gets the last statement is actually the disciple who leaned on Jesus's breast, and he's also the anonymous first disciple mentioned on the scene with Jesus in chapter 1. So it's kind of, so with that background of my perspective of John, Kind of tell me what you think about that. Like what, so my perspective is it's actually a group gospel. It's multiple people telling their stories because there's stories of other apostles in John that are not in the synoptics, like Nathaniel, Judas, not Iscariot, Philip, etc. So with my perspective, can you see how like maybe the epilogue and prologue doesn't concern me understanding all this?
Yeah, I can see that, but when you say the epilogue, do you mean John 1:1 or John chapter
The
1 anyway?
prologue being John 1 through pretty much verse 14, the epilogue being the whole chapter 21.
Okay.
So you have the we and us guys in the beginning, you got the we and us guys in the end, and they're pretty much admitting that they're a group. It's a plural group, and then they jump right in. See, that's the weird part about the end of John. It's like you have him saying, this report was that he would never die. He's like, well, that's not what Jesus said. And the reason I know that is because I'm the one that he said that to. There's my Message Bible version. I'm the one he said that to. And we know his, now talking in the third person about the guy, his testimony is true, which to me kind of goes with that Muratorian fragment. You have a narrator and a writer. They asked John to narrate this thing, not write it. So to me, that's kind of like that Johannine group is affirming John's testimony as additional eyewitnesses who can support his statements. And that's not just true of the Gospel of John. You have the we, us, and our in John 1:1, 1 John 1:1-4. You have them in 2 John and 3 John. All of the time it mentions our joy, our etc. And that's why I think that, and it's interesting if you go to 3 John, by the way, it says, we, and you know that our testimony is true.
Yeah.
Not his testimony is true, which tells me that I personally believe 3 John was a different penman than the Gospel of John. I think it was John the Elder, not John the Apostle, who wrote 2 and 3 John. And it's him writing individualistically upon himself at the group, but not talking about John the Apostle. But anyway, those are different books. But does that make more sense? I guess my position.
Yeah. My issue is, one, your position very much hinges on the Muratorian fragment, which the dating on that is almost as crazy as P66. Some scholars place it slightly before Tertullian. Some people place it slightly after. So that's still, and the manuscript they have is it's Latin, right? I haven't.
It is Latin.
The original manuscript is dated. Isn't it dated to like the 13th or 14th century? But the manuscript itself, not the
manuscript itself, is later. It's earlier than that, but it's kind of dated based on statements of who's in it. So it end of the 2nd century.
Yeah, because
I corroborate that with Irenaeus and Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria, which I didn't go into in that video because that wasn't a whole discussion on John, but I corroborate that with the testimony of these others as well, in addition, and the Anti-Marcionian Prologue. So I'm not fully reliant on the Muratorian fragment. I'm only reliant on the fact that there was multiple people. But even when you look at Clement, for example, he kind of talks about how John was with a group. There are a couple of fathers who mention that he's with people when this needed to be written. So he wrote about the 3 gospels, or he knew about the other 3 gospels. He welcomed and testified their truth, but it kind of mentions that he's in a group and they're kind of pushing him to do this thing. So it's the Muratorian fragment. It's kind of connected to what some of the other church fathers are saying. And then it's also the we, us, and our continues to show up in a plural form as if it is, we beheld his glory. I don't see how an individual writing that for himself would benefit by just saying we beheld his glory or we touched him in 1 John 1.
Yeah.
When he's speaking on behalf of himself as a person, as an individual who was with Jesus. To me, it seems like he's speaking on behalf of a group.
No, I think you're right. There's a lot written on the Johannine community. I wish I had time to read up on it. But yeah, I definitely think that, I mean, all you can really do is make maybe educated speculation on this topic. Uh, but
Sure.
but yeah, I think that the Gospel of John and the rest of the Gospels as well are using multiple sources. It's entirely possible that the community, because each gospel was written for a specific community to teach a
100%.
specific theology, a specific Christology, what have you. Take Martian, for example. He used a version of Matthew, but he left out the first 2 chapters because he didn't like the virgin birth. So that's kind of what they did, is they heard all these stories, they heard all these sources, and so they put together something that they thought was accurate.
Well, you and I would differ on the fact that you think it was Christian communities, where I would believe they were based on the eyewitnesses themselves, being Mark reported Peter's sermons. I have a weird view of Matthew. I say weird because I get called weird, but like I don't think we. Well, let's hear it. So I think that everybody talks about how Matthew.
I love weird theories.
Everybody talks about how Matthew is first, and they're like, well, the data shows Mark is first, and yet all the church fathers are unanimously saying that it's Matthew. Matthew is first. Well, one of the things that I came to realize when I was doing, especially my doctoral work on the Gospels, is how people do not read the whole context of the church fathers. Every single one of them, including Papias, every single one of them says it was in Hebrew or Aramaic. And actually what I'll do, I mean, just for the fun of it, I'll actually read multiple statements, and just so people listening to this, my own followers and listeners can hear this. Papias said, Matthew put these sayings, that's the logia, in an ordered arrangement in the Hebrew dialect. Irenaeus said, Matthew indeed among the Hebrews in their own dialect, the Hebrew dialect, put forth the writings of the gospel of Peter and Paul. Jerome said, well, I'll get to Jerome. Pontineus, for example, when he died around 190. He went far east into India, and he reports that when he was going there, he thought he was bringing the gospel for the very first time to the Indian people. And he turns out that he was wrong. Bartholomew had already gone there, and that they had a writing of Matthew in the Hebrew letters. Origin says, Pontineus. Eusebius reports it. It's in Eusebius's history 5.10.3 to make it easier if you want to write that. It's history, ecclesiastical history 5.10.3. Eusebius reports what Pontineus said there, but that Bartholomew had already made it there, and then Pontineus gets there and goes, oh wait, the gospel's already been here. And then he finds a copy of Matthew, and he finds Matthew's copy in Hebrew. Origen said, very similar. He said, who published it for those out of Judaism who came to believe, composed it as it was in the Hebrew language, or composed it in Hebrew letters. Eusebius said the same thing. I mean, Jerome said the same thing. What people didn't do is read what they're actually saying. And so I started investigating Matthew from that perspective. Like, is there any evidence that Matthew originated in another language before it went to Greek? Well, number one hint is it does not quote from the Septuagint, except one place that I have found. Everywhere else, it's doing its own translation. It does not follow the Septuagint like Luke or John do. It is following some kind of its own translation. And even Jerome talks about how he had received a copy when he was translating the Vulgate in Rome. He received a copy of a Hebrew Matthew in Caesarea. It was brought to him, and he talks about how it was delivered to him, and the Ebionites wanted him to translate it for him. He talks about a guy named Pamphilus, and Pamphilus brought him this copy, which tells me that the Hebrew Matthew was almost extinct by the time Jerome's writing and translating at the end of the 4th century. So Jerome doesn't, sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, yeah, sure. Good.
So there's no circulated Hebrew Matthew. You got to go find a transcript of it down in the Caesarean library just to even find one. Ebionites are like, hey, give us a translation of that, which tells me that they're probably not identical texts. In fact, what we have illusions of is that there's a story in the Hebrew Matthew where Jesus appears to his brother James the Just after the resurrection, which Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 15, but our Gospel of Matthew in Greek does not mention that at all. So that caused me to go, okay, so they're not identical. It was out of circulation by the 5th century. At least a lot of it's not identical. Papias says it's predominantly logia. It's sayings, it's teachings of Jesus.
Right. Similar to the Gospel of Thomas.
Right, exactly. And so to me, I used to believe in this concept of Q, and I really don't think Q is important anymore. And even secular scholars outside of Christendom is some of them are starting to abandon Q. And what's that?
So yeah, like if I was it, I can't remember his name.
There's a couple. Yeah, there's a couple that are big name ones that came out recently. They're just uncertain about it. I know that at Duke University,
right on the tip of my tongue. What's his name? He's like the main one that argues against Q.
Is that a Duke? Talking about a Duke University?
Oh, he wrote
Goodacre.
He wrote the case against Q.
Okay, so Goodacre has some statements about Q recently.
Yeah, Goodacre. There it is. Yeah,
Goodacre. Yeah,
Mark
so Goodacre. He's at right. He's at Duke University. Tremendous scholar. Certainly don't agree with him on stuff, but I do listen to him. I do listen to him. I've read his research, but to me, the logia, the statements, and what's important is what Papias said, and I'll read it. Papias said at the end of it, but each person interpreted them as best as he could. Now, the word interpreted is kind of confusing because it can have multiple meanings. It could mean to translate, which is, I think, is what he's saying here. And then that cuts off, and Eusebius, unfortunately, doesn't tell us the rest of what he says there. But he's saying these people translated these Hebrew sayings later, and so I started doing some investigation on this, Ricky, and I ended up finding out that they actually are historical reports of other people attributing translation of Matthew from Hebrew to Greek. So I pulled it up, and I found that Athanasius mentioned in Alexandria, he attributed the translation of Matthew to James, the brother of Jesus. Theodorus attribute. Yes, he did. And that was in his summary of the Holy Scriptures. He attributed the translation of Matthew.
I could go back in time and punch in the face. It would be Athanasius. But anyway.
Athanasius. You don't like Alexandrians? Come on.
He's the sole reason Revelation was added into the New Testament. And that's what got us into this mess we're in today. But anyway, whole nother topic we don't have to go into.
But Theodorus attributes the translation to Barnabas. In fact, there's a statement in Theodorus Lector. It says the relics of the apostle Barnabas were found in Cyprus under a carob tree, and on his breast there was the Gospel of Matthew, written by Barnabas his own hand. And so now you see that like there's reports of Barnabas having his hand in this. Theophylact and Epiphanius attributed the translation to John. They didn't specify which one. They said the Gospel according to Matthew was written by him in the East with Hebraic language and letters, and was published in Jerusalem and later translated by John. And so I started going, okay, wait a minute. All of these figures were Antioch, Jerusalem church members. And then you go to the Didache, which my dissertation was on Codex H, which contains the Didache in it. And the Didache quotes the Gospel of Matthew 25 times definitely, and potentially 4 more. And then rarely Mark, maybe 1 or 2 in Mark, and I think 3 or 4 in Luke, and none in John. And so you start seeing that the Didache quotes it, but it calls it the Gospel of the Lord. It doesn't call it the Gospel of Matthew. And so, but it's quoting it word for word in many places. I mean, entire 3 and 4 verses at a time in the Greek Matthew. But it's calling it the Gospel of the Lord on 2 occasions in the Didache 8, and I think it's Didache 15. And I'm sitting there thinking, okay, so it's already been translated by the end of the 1st century. And because I believe the Didache is between 90 and 100. And so then you have these alleged statements from Papias saying these people translated them the best that they could. And so what I believe happened in Matthew is that the Hebrew gospel of Matthew could only circulate to the beginning of Jesus's ministry, and that's to Jews only. It does no good. Mark would have been published in Greek. This is my opinion. I know we would differ on the dates here. I believe Mark was published in Greek from Rome, where Mark had recorded the sermons of Peter, published them in Rome. So that was already circulating. Luke was already starting to put together his collection at that point, in my opinion. And Matthew's starting to realize our gospel, the group there in Jerusalem, the headquarters of the church of Antioch in Jerusalem, between Syria and Israel, would have realized this gospel narrative will not reach beyond our borders. We need to get it into Greek. I believe that Matthew is an accumulation of taking Matthew's eyewitness testimony he collected in Hebrew, which would have predominantly consisted of the Sermon on the Mount and also the Olivet Discourse, because that's the first time we would have seen this, in which are the teachings of, these are teachings of Jesus, not narratives, teachings. So I think that Matthew's eyewitness testimony of the teachings taken with Peter's eyewitness testimony in Mark, so they would use Mark as a template, because Mark is a star. I mean, if Peter's behind Mark, he's a star witness. He was an eyewitness at events that Matthew can't relate to. You have Peter's eyewitness testimony in Mark. You have Matthew following it. You have all these church leaders in Jerusalem, maybe Barnabas, maybe James, maybe these people are right. Maybe some of these guys were involved in translating it into Greek, and they would have taken the Hebrew Logia, and they would have taken Mark's gospel and a collection of some other statements and testimonies from the apostles still in Jerusalem, and they published the gospel of Matthew as the gospel of the Lord on behalf of the church of Jerusalem and on behalf of the church of Syria there in Antioch in Syria, which would explain why the Didache predominantly uses that gospel over the others, because regionally they're in the same area. And so Matthew would have been published in Greek on behalf of the whole church, which they would have never attributed it to Matthew. They would have attributed it to the Lord's gospel. It's a story about him. But Matthew's name would have been attached to it because he would have been the one that started the process of creating this gospel to begin with. And he would have probably been the one that formed it up. So that's my position on the gospel of Matthew. I think there were two Matthews. I think the Hebrew Matthew is an incomplete Matthew, and it was only sufficient to the church for a time, and that it needed to go into Greek to make it outside of its borders, and that it utilized Mark as its basis and engage to actually carry the narrative on, but actually corrected the order, because we've learned from the church fathers, Mark was never written in order. It wasn't intended to be written in order necessarily either, but Matthew is a little bit more chronological than Mark. So that's my position of Matthew. And I don't know, most people look at me like, I don't know, man. Like, I think the Hebrew Matthew and the Greek Matthew would have been the same. It's like, well, I think you got a lot of explaining to do because they don't seem to be the same from all the reports that we have of them. So that's my view of Matthew.
Okay. Interesting.
But I do think Matthew is involved. I just don't think he was the only one.
But how can you even deduce that Matthew himself was involved, aside from, or is it just because of Papias's account?
Well, it'd have been with Papias. I mean, it would have been, I mean, all of them are saying the same thing with Matthew, whether you're talking about Irenaeus or Tertullian. I mean, they're all saying that Matthew was a part of this in collecting Jesus's teachings, and that he published a account in his name. Jerome's getting a manuscript with his name on it in Hebrew from Caesarea. He apparently at some point, based on what all they are saying, is that he would have sat down at some point in the ministry of Jesus and began to write some of his teachings. And that actually makes sense too, because if you look at the early literature of the Jewish Christians, for example, you take the book of James. James is very alienated from any gospel connection at all of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But then again, if you look closely, he's patterning himself after the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount. All the teachings that are in James can be brought back to Matthew 5, 6, and 7. I have a whole list showing the parallel. And then all of a sudden in chapter 5 of James, he goes apocalyptic in the first couple sections about Jesus. And isn't it weird that the ending of Matthew is apocalyptic, where Jesus is teaching the Olivet Discourse? So to me, it's possible that James was actually patterning his teachings of Jesus in the premature stage that they were actually in written form, which would have only been a circulated Hebrew Matthew at the time, which would have been only collecting the sayings of Jesus, not the whole narrative of Jesus, which includes the Sermon on the Mount and the Olivet Discourse, which James can parallel all of those. So I think that James actually wouldn't have had the gospel accounts. It would have had a Hebrew Matthew account, which would have just been a collection of what was taught. And we see the early prayers, the Jewish scriptures that are the Jewish writers that come out and talk about the New Testament. A lot of the church early on rallied around Jesus's teachings on the Sermon on the Mount. And that would make sense if that's pretty much the earliest stages of any account they have of Jesus written down outside of the apostles teaching it. That's just my perspective.
Okay. What do I even do with that?
You think it's plausible? Do you at least think it's plausible?
I think that we have such a lack of data on the topic that any number of things can be possible. There's a lot of different possibilities. Maybe that's one of them. But my issue is one of the many. Is that like you point out, the Gospels are quoted numerous times by the early church fathers, but they're not called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John until Irenaeus. In fact, is it Justin Martyr that calls it the Memoirs of the Apostle?
Yeah, he does as well, and he attributes.
So nobody's saying Matthew said this. John said. No one is saying, even the early Gospels aside, because they don't claim they're eyewitnesses. None of the early church fathers are saying that this eyewitness Matthew saw this, and he says none of them are saying that. They're just quoting sayings of Lord. And it is until Irenaeus who says, "Yeah, this is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John." So to posit that the Gospels are written by eyewitnesses is a claim. Fine, we can explore that. Scholars have been doing that for hundreds of years. But at the end of the day, it's not. The evidence to support that claim is not convincing, simply because the authors do not name themselves. That's the big problem, and nobody names them. I don't think everything in the Gospels is made up. I think some of the things in the Gospels Jesus said, I think is a historic figure. I think some of the events are probably more or less historically accurate. But I don't think they're written by eyewitnesses. I think these are stories that circulate. I'm sure you've heard the whole Bart Ehrman lecture. Mm-hmm. This is the consensus among scholars. These are stories that circulated over time, and until they got to somebody who could write them down. So you take, like you talked about the Sermon on the Mount. How long is the Sermon on the Mount? Like almost a full chapter.
It's more than that. It's almost 3 chapters.
Is it
extended? Yeah, because he continues to go on and on all the way to chapter 7.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
from chapter 5 all the way down. Yeah,
that even more supports my point. And Matthew wasn't written until what, 40 years after Jesus' death?
Depends on if you believe Matthew was writing things down as Jesus was teaching, kind of. As far as the Greek published gospel, yes.
Right.
I guess my thing with that go ahead. Sorry, go ahead. Finish your thought. No, go ahead and finish your thought.
Oh, fine. Guess I'll go then. I'm gonna be here. I think the first things to circulate about Jesus were his teachings, because that was pretty typical of the time.
Sure.
Philosophers, other messianic figures, their teachings were what was written down, which was circulated via oral tradition. There wasn't much about their life. Same thing with Jesus. You take a look at Paul. Paul doesn't talk about Jesus very much. He talks about his death and resurrection. Doesn't talk about like I said in the video, No miracles, no virgin birth, no empty tomb, no healing or feeding the 5,000. No, like none of this is in Paul, because I don't think it mattered to him at that point. The tradition of Jesus was not that developed by that point. And it wasn't until after Paul, when the stories continued to circulate and people started maybe adding their own flair to it, like, oh, I heard he did this, I heard he did that. Maybe, just maybe, drawing inspiration from other figures within Hellenistic theology. In the Bacchae, there's a Greek god Bacchae. And this is when was it written? 1st century BCE, 2nd century BCE. Anyway, he's a god who takes the form of a man, and he comes down to earth, and he performs miracles, does all these things. It's one of those like typical like messianic or Jesus parallel figures you kind of think, or you've heard of. So maybe they've heard these stories, and so they're like either getting their details mixed up, or they're trying to embellish these stories about Jesus. I heard he fed 3,000. I heard he fed 5,000. You guys, and eventually it gets to somebody who can write them down. Did they use multiple sources? Sure. Did it start with one of his disciples? Probably. Sure. Like I said, I think a lot of things that is recorded in the Gospels that Jesus said, he did actually say. But as far as his deeds, it's weird that Paul doesn't talk about them and nobody else talks about them until 30, 40, 50 years or 40, 50, 60 years after the fact. If Jesus was walking around healing people, curing the blind, curing women's menstrual cycles, doing all these things, claiming he was God in the flesh, it's weird that nobody wrote about that for 40, 50, 60 years.
Yeah, I think the occasion. Well, the early church would have definitely been more interested in the oral teaching than a written text. In fact, that's kind of the thing that we find about Mark writing for Peter. Like Peter it wasn't his idea based on everything we have of that. It was like, hey man, you're a wanted man. You're pretty much on death row every day. How about like you die? Everything you know goes with you. Same thing with John. John wasn't, according to what we have of John, the statements we have there, he wasn't really into like, I want to write a story about Jesus. I want to have because even as Papias said, he said he would rather hear it from the living and abiding voices. He would rather have the eyewitnesses say it. But they became realists. They became realists at some point and said, you know what, when we die, oral tradition dies with us. It has to be put to text. And I think that kind of going back to the point of origin, the thing that has to be recognized about some of these church fathers, whether it's Irenaeus or Papias or Clement of Alexandria, dealing with the text, these representatives, these speakers are a part of churches that were started by the apostles themselves. Many of these guys were actually hearers of the apostles, like Papias. Irenaeus was a second generation from John. He learned from Polycarp, who spent his time with John. So he didn't know John personally, but he knew the man who did know John personally, and he was commissioned by Polycarp to be where he was. And so he tells stories about what he learned from John, or from Polycarp about John and stuff like that. So he had pretty close information too. Papias, having known a minimum of 2 eyewitnesses, I would say 3. I think Aristion, John the Elder were 2, and John the Apostle was separate from John the Elder, but 2 or 3. You start seeing, and then he also knew Philip and the 4 daughters as well, in addition to these others. So these sources are coming from apostolic churches, and what I mean by that is these churches had a strong connection to these texts because they knew their origin. and they were speaking of their origin because there were multiple texts that had come into the churches by this point that they were already rejecting. Even when Luke opens his beginning gospel, there is like many have attempted to do this.
Oh, Paul does
so
that. Even
what's that?
So Paul does that even as letters.
What do you mean?
Paul says in, I think it's Galatians, where he says,
People
are
were forging in his name. Yeah.
Like,
and he tells the Thessalonian church that he's going to leave a salutation with his hand in it to differentiate a forgery versus his own. And he did it in big letters. He talks about how he wrote it in big letters to the Galatian church.
And Thessalonians is his earliest letter. It's First Thessalonians is most likely the earliest letter.
I think so. I think so as well.
I agree with that.
And I think that also creates the dilemma. Fun fact on the side. I think that creates the dilemma within the manuscripts between how Romans ends. Because if you look at some of the Byzantine manuscripts, the ending of Romans is placed after chapter 14. Whereas it's different. It has a different ending. But in Romans, he mentioned, what's that?
So
where is my, oh no. If you actually, I don't have it with me. Oh no.
It's all right. I'll look it up.
Yeah, look it up. So Romans, where you end Romans changes because it does seem like there's a double ending there. And I think the explanation is in the end of Romans, it says, I, Tertius, wrote these things to you. So his amanuensis was Tertius, the end of Romans. So Paul, to make it authentic, would not just be able to have a scribe. He also would have to put his salutation in there with his own hand if he's consistent with what he's telling the churches to keep their eyes open for. And so I think where Paul put his salutation in hand was mixed up. And that's why we have manuscripts with different endings. Because it's like, I think that Tertius wrote an ending and I think Paul put his own hand ending in there to authenticate it. So that's just a fun fact on the side. But on the gospel side of things, these church fathers have begun to initiate what they had passed on to them in those very churches the apostles had started 50, 40, 30, and in some cases 20 years before them. And what I find interesting is that the churches in North Africa and the churches in the Alexandria region or in Caesarea or Jerusalem or Antioch or in the East, a lot of these men never knew each other. Like they never met each other. And yet they have the same origin stories of the gospels. They may have nuances to it, but they have the same statements from where these gospels originated. And they never actually got a chance to like meet together and say, like, how should we explain these gospels?
Well, how do you know they didn't? Or how do you know they didn't have access to those sources?
Well, I mean, the simple answer is, I mean, we can assume, I can't say 100%, but
sure.
They never mention each other. Like Irenaeus does mention Papias. He does mention Polycarp. But he doesn't mention, obviously he would have been in a different region of the world too. So Tertullian was in Rome. He eventually went down into North Africa.
But they don't even have to have any encounters with each other. They could just have access to what they've written or even oral tradition. That
I mean, clearly they had the same common interest of attacking Marcion, and because, I mean, Irenaeus did it as well as Tertullian did it. So they would have had
waves.
Very much, as Tertullian said, he mutilated Luke's gospel, and changed the name to the Gospel of Paul, which is unique. Which goes back to kind of a second statement too that I was going to bring up. You mentioned that Paul doesn't really deal with the narratives of Jesus and stuff, and I would actually agree with that. He does go to the lineage aspect to a second. He says that he's of the seed of David. It depends on if you accept, I should say, if you accept First Timothy as Pauline. But what's interesting is Paul says,
I would think Paul believed that Jesus was of the line of David.
Line of David, sure, yeah, it makes sense. Any Jew expected a messianic
or not.
Yeah,
I think he believed that. Yeah,
to have a messianic Jew that wanted to see a Messiah come, they were all looking through the bloodline of David. I mean, even Dead Sea Scrolls that were written before the New Testament were trying to figure out how's he going to come. They were trying to allude to 2 Samuel 7, king on David's throne forever. They were all looking for a messianic king from David. But Paul says in Romans, he also says it in, again, you can go back at another time if you want. If you're bored sometime, go listen to my podcast on the pastoral epistles. But when you deal with Paul in Romans, and then one statement in First Timothy, you have this phrase, according to my gospel. And one of the things that Eusebius noted about that statement is that his research, apparently he was intrigued by it. He researched the statement and came from some of the earliest witnesses that Paul was talking about the Gospel of Luke, which is consistent with two things. One, everybody who talks about the origin of Luke early on, the Irenaeuses, the Tertullians, these documents that we've already been discussing over and over, they all mention that Paul approved this commissioning or this work to be done so that he could have a gospel in his ministry to carry with him with a narrative of Jesus. There's two reasons I think this is probably true. Number one, when you go to First Timothy, for example, in chapter 5, it says in verse 18, for the scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, quoting Deuteronomy, and a laborer deserves his wages, or a laborer is worthy of his hire. Now, Matthew and Luke both report that teaching of Jesus, but what's unique is that the scripture is singular, but you have two equal clauses in the Greek here, and the laborer deserves his wages, and the ox will not be muzzled out when it treads out the grain is an equal clause. And both are being, as those equal clauses, going back to the same representative noun, scripture. And so when First Timothy is quoting scripture, it gives two under the same title because they're equal clauses. One of them is Deuteronomy. One of them is the teaching of Jesus. And that teaching of Jesus is word for word out of Luke's gospel. It's got one variant from Matthew, which would probably not make it to Matthew, but it has word for word from Luke. And I've heard people say, well, Stephen, that's probably an oral tradition or a reserved teaching of Jesus that everybody knew, and it was one that was passed on. The problem is he says it's a graphe, it's a written text, it's a scripture, and it's given equal status to Deuteronomy. And so I actually think that Paul didn't need to give a narrative. This is my opinion. I don't think Paul needed to give a narrative of Jesus' ministry and life. And so when he says that he is the root of David, he's the seed of David according to my gospel, which I know you would dispute the pastorals. When he makes that statement, I think what he's doing is he's talking about the lineage setup that was in Luke's gospel. So I've proved that his lineage is David in my gospel, going back to Luke being the second person who actually has a lineage of Jesus connected to David. But again, this is my opinion. I know you disagree with me. We're just sharing our opinions here and leaving it there.
I'm absorbing it all and jostling.
Sure.
It around in my head.
Sure. So I tend to believe that Luke's gospel was Paul's, and that is why Marcion, so my second reason I mentioned, is when Marcion mutilated it, he changed it to the name of Paul. And I think that's because he recognized that if you're going to change a gospel, you don't put a non-apostle's name on it or a non-eyewitness's name on it. Luke is really not that significant in the New Testament at all. Luke names out, puts Paul's name on it, and creates a gospel from the text of Luke mixed in with some other nuances or cutouts. And so it's interesting that Marcion even recognized by cutting Luke's name off of it that the gospel could be traced to the name Luke. Whether he actually believed it was Luke, he recognized very early on it was assigned to Luke. And he removed the assigned name of Luke and put Paul on there, which could indicate he recognized that it was part of Paul's teachings to begin with. So that's my opinion, kind of to answer some of the dilemma there that you mentioned, like with Paul. I don't think he would have to mention all that because I think he had his gospel carried out with him in his travels. And I actually demonstrated in my class. And I do want to conclude today, by the way, with you and me talking about apologetics. I know you mentioned, I teach a high school class, and I'm sure they're going to watch this. So they'd like a shout out.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah, there you go. So
friendly
one of the
things
here. Friendly neighbor. He's in Pennsylvania. It's a distant neighbor.
Yeah, very, very.
But
don't come.
But
here.
when you're talking about, so we demonstrated in class. So we took the anti-Marcionite prologue and Muratorian fragment. We took it with Acts and the we, us, our guy traveling. And we kind of did a timeline of when Luke would have been written just based on those documents. And I even said, and my class will back me on this, I said, we can't say this is a fact, but we can take some historical documents and create a framework that's plausible for when the Gospel of Luke would have been written. And based on the anti-Marcionite prologue, it talks about Luke, his age when he died. The Muratorian fragment talks about when he wrote it, where he was when he wrote it. They talk about Luke being 84 years old when he died. He died in central Greece. He never married, never had children. I mean, it gives all this information about Luke's life. It's in the, all right, so let me pull that one up as well. Yeah, I'll go over that.
I'll take your word for it. I just hadn't, I don't remember.
So the anti-Marcionite prologue is the one I'm talking about, mixed with the Muratorian fragment. So the Marcionite prologue says he was a doctor by profession, a disciple of the apostles, followed Paul up to his martyrdom, serving the Lord blamelessly. He never had a wife, never fathered children, died at the age of 84, full of the Holy Spirit in Boeotia, central Greece. Therefore, although the Gospels had already been written, indeed, Matthew in Judea, by Mark in Italy, moved by the Holy Spirit, he wrote down the Gospel in parts of Achaia, and indeed, afterwards, the same Luke wrote the Acts of the Apostles. The Muratorian fragment says, third book of the Gospels, according to Luke, the well-known physician, after the ascension of Christ, when Paul had taken him as his companion of traveling, composed it in his own name, according to the general belief. Yet he himself had not seen the Lord in the flesh, and therefore, as he was able to ascertain events, so indeed he began to tell the story of the birth of John. And so what I gave a summary is when you take these two statements, the Muratorian fragment, anti-Marcionite prologue, and Acts' timeline of Paul's missionary journeys, you could timeline when he would have been with the eyewitnesses, when he would have written it in central Greece, which is where it's allegedly been written. So Luke traveled with Paul probably around 50, 52 AD, starting in Acts 16, if we believe that we, us, our guy is Luke. The Muratorian fragment states it happened when he was with Paul, so it's no earlier than 52. The anti-Marcionite prologue says that it took place while in the area of Achaia. Paul went there on a couple of occasions, one before the we, us, our guy. But the main time frame with the we, us, our guy is in Acts 19, which is around 55 to 56 AD. And it was here Paul likely wrote 2 Corinthians. And Luke and Titus would have took that letter for Paul to the Corinthians, if you believe Paul wrote 2 Corinthians. Then I mentioned how the timeline actually works with Luke gaining the proper documentation because he spent a year in Jerusalem, and the we, us, our guy spent a year in Antioch from Acts 18. He would have been there with the other apostles that were still alive in Jerusalem and Antioch for that 1 year he was with him. So he would have collected the data around that time of 53 to 54 AD. And then, according to what they're saying, he wrote it while they were in central Greece with Paul, and that would have been around 57 to 58 AD in Paul's travels. And that's about the same exact time that Paul wrote the book of Romans. So I personally think this is possible that Paul wrote the book of Romans the same time Luke was finishing Luke. And when he sent the book of Romans back to Rome, he attached Luke's gospel with it. So when he says for the first time ever in his writings, according to my gospel, which is in Romans, I believe it's in chapter 2, verse 16, he was actually insinuating that they would know what he's saying because he attached his own gospel account with the book of Romans, because the timeline would be identical. And as I told my class, it's not, we can't say, 100% definitely written around 57, 58. But if we just take some historical documents, trace the framework of them, mix it in with where we know Paul was traveling with the we, us, our guy, it is possible for him to have collected the eyewitness data in Jerusalem and Antioch for about a year to 18 months most. And then he would have had about 2.5 to 3 years to write it all out and to compile the account by that timeline. So it is possible from that front. It doesn't guarantee it, but again, it's something else to think about. So that's Luke.
Okay. Wow, that was a lot.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
I have to talk fast.
I appreciate the information. I'm just like trying to decide like where do I respond?
Which angle?
Is it right?
Just say,
The law.
Stephen, you're wrong. Like, Stephen, you're
You're
wrong.
wrong,
Like,
Stephen. Jesus.
thank you.
No, wait. So you think that the author of Luke and Acts was Paul, or at least Paul gathered information himself and then wrote Romans and Second Corinthians along the way during his missionary journeys? Is that what you? Or did
No, I
I
think that. So, no, sorry. So I think Mark personally was written by dictation. I think that Mark wrote exactly what he was told to write. That's what Papias said. I think Luke, being whoever wrote Luke, was a phenomenal writer. Like, their understanding of Greek is, I mean, it's a blend of classical. It is. I mean, there's a reason you don't start in Luke when you're taking Greek in seminary. Like, you don't start in Luke because you're like, what word is that? Where do I find that word? I find it funny that when Jerome was translating the Vulgate, he talks about the complexity of Luke's Greek. He probably had to pull out some old classical Greek volumes to find out the meanings to put it into Latin.
Who was it that sorry, wait a second. Who was it that said the author of Revelation can't have been John, because the author of Revelation is very simple Greek and the author of John's Gospel is much more complex?
Yeah.
Who was that?
Well, there's quite a few people that have insinuated it. It was insinuated very early on.
This is like the second century. One of the early church fathers said that. And I can't remember.
And I think that, and now that's where our good friend Bacchum,
oh dear,
which congratulations, we haven't talked about him too much tonight. But he actually believes that the Johns are different. You have the John,
I think it's John the Elder.
John the Elder. Eusebius kind of plays onto that. I think Eusebius really wanted the book of Revelation not to be attached to John the Apostle at all cost. Like, I really don't think Eusebius he was highly skeptical of the book of Revelation. The way he talks about. Yeah, Eusebius.
That might actually be who I was talking about.
Yeah, Eusebius was critical of the aspect of Revelation. He clearly didn't want the book of Revelation, but he also could not deny its early usage in the church. He was kind of stuck at a rock and a hard place on, all right, I'm a historian here. I've got to report the data, but I have my own opinion.
A group of Christians in North Africa about the book of Revelation, but like he quoted it at them, but he didn't believe it himself. I'm sorry, I'm trying to piece together.
You're brainstorming.
I haven't thought about it in a while, but there's an account of.
So here's the thing here's my philosophy of John and the book of Revelation. I think it's interesting. So again, if Revelation was written around 96, 97, which my semi-preterist friends want the whole New Testament to be done before 70 AD, I'm sorry if you're listening, you are wrong. There's no way. No, I don't think any of the Johannine corpus was before 70 AD. But if John had professional scribes for, let's say, John and First John, if he's marooned on the island of Patmos and he is stuck without his friends to write for him, I would expect. So here's the thing: like, I don't think that the disciples, though they may have been partially illiterate, whatever debate we want to have on that one, partially, half, mostly, etc. I don't think that they necessarily
on Luke. And here we
What's
are
that?
here. So yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, we didn't even get a finish. We're on another topic already. Go ahead, though.
Yeah, I just don't think that all the apostles stayed that way forever. Like, because they left their fisherman business to become teachers and instructors. So it's possible that they could have been educated, and then they were around a lot of educated people. I mean, I think about Peter being with Paul for a while, and they were around guys that were educated. They could have learned at least the basics. So I think it's possible, my opinion of Revelation, why it's so different than John, is because John is a group gospel with professional scribes and him just narrating. But when he's on the island of Patmos and he said, hey, Jesus says, you need to write this, write this, write this, write this. Well, he don't have his professional scribes to write. He's stuck with his elementary abilities. And that's why I think the Greek in Revelation is actually so poor, is because it is a fisherman who had a basic education somewhere after his time of being a disciple of Jesus, conjured up all that he could in his education level to write what he was seeing. And again, I know people disagree with me on that, but to me, I think that we can explain why John and Revelation are so different is because he's separated from his professional scribes at Ephesus. He's marooned on an island by himself. And we see he'd flunk Greek class. I mean, he would flunk my seminary Greek classes if he had to come in with his sentence
Greek was a
structure.
second language.
It probably was. I think so. Aramaic was probably I would say that Aramaic was probably their predominant language of speaking. Hebrew was pretty much for
no question.
Well, Hebrew is for the higher class. I mean, but there was a Hellenization too, where the Greek speaking Jews were around, very early on, even when the church was being started. There in Acts, you had Hellenized women who were like, hey, we're being neglected over here. The widows were being neglected. So there were Jews that were known for being Hellenized, but you don't really see that accusation on the apostolic group because of their location in Galilee being so close. They would have definitely been more Aramaic. I think you would agree, right? They were probably speaking Aramaic.
Yeah. I think that they're originally Aramaic speaking Christians. Yeah. And I think, Paul was obviously very Hellenized. He quotes Greek literature. He quotes Plato's Republic multiple times. So yeah, he was very Hellenized.
He would have known Hebrew. He would have gone through the whole education. He would have probably known Latin. He probably would have learned, as a Roman citizen, he probably would have known Latin as well. I would have imagined. But Paul would have been through the whole education system. I mean, he was under the great rabbis. I mean, he had an opportunity that the apostles. Is Derek there?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, there is. I'm sorry. I probably should have been paying attention this whole time to.
I've been glancing over occasionally. Sorry, guys. Not trying to ignore y'all.
But for kind of going back to, there are other explanations for differences in writings at the end of the day. Like just looking at the event of Revelation versus a scenario like John, it can still be the same individual involved. And I'm not excluding the possibility of a John the Elder writing. I actually recently posted 2 of my podcast releases that I have confirmed by my belief that 2nd and 3rd John are John the Elder writing, not John the Apostle. Really? But he's still a part of the same group. He's still a part of the John group in Ephesus. But if there were 2 Johns, and I went through how even Jerome, Eusebius, there were 3 or 4 I pulled out of people who said, we don't know which John it was. We know there's 2 tombs with 2 different Johns associated with the ministry of Jesus. We don't know which one's which. So maybe it is John the Elder. So there was uncertainty of 2nd and 3rd John being, maybe it was John the Elder that did it. I personally think it was John the Elder that wrote 2nd and 3rd John, not John the Apostle. But nonetheless, there are different occasions for the different writings under different circumstances where it can be traced to John. And Irenaeus talks about how the revelation happened during the time of Domitian. And he said, not too far from our day. And so he was not many years away from the event, 40, 50 years. And again, he was commissioned and trained by Polycarp, who spent his life with John. And so it's kind of like, how can I reject his testimony alone? I mean, it doesn't make him right, but he's close to the situation. He's very close to the situation. And he's saying it happened to John when he was marooned during the time of Domitian, which is an interesting theory in of itself. But I cannot, to my semi-preterist friends, I cannot put the book of Revelation in 69 AD. I mean, come on.
There's so many reasons why that's
it doesn't work. But for Paul and these other guys, I mean, just kind of going back to the Gospels, you were talking about Luke specifically. Mark would have been writing under dictation. Luke seemed to have latitude, where Paul was kind of like, I don't know if this is the way it went. This is the way I imagine in my mind. Hey, man, I'm really busy trying to deal with all these problems in these churches. I mean, the Corinthians have people sleeping with their mother-in-laws. I mean, we've got all these problems. I need to focus on writing these letters. Luke, you are, that's where we got off our tangent. Whoever wrote Luke was educated, very, very educated. What's that?
Said, and we're back.
And we're back. We're back on topic. And whoever traveled with Paul, that was an educated man could have done this, he would have been collecting data as he went, and he would have actually taken that information. And that's why I say in the timeline of Luke, we actually find that it's possible the we us our guy was in Jerusalem and Antioch for at least a year, maybe even longer. That would have given an opportunity to talk to James. He mentions his eyewitness sources in places like Philip, and he mentions Cleopas. Cleopas is a funny story about him and where he can come from. That's another time, but who he is related to. But this individual had time to actually accumulate accounts and write it for Paul. So it would have been more free scribal work than dictation. So Paul would have just had to approve it. And I think that's the difference between Luke and the many, because if you read Luke carefully, he is claiming to be a part of that same clan, that same group. He is a part of the many that are attempting. He's admitting in the very beginning he's not an eyewitness.
Yeah.
So what makes his account outlast the others if he's not an eyewitness? Well, the only way churches would begin to accept an account that others could not accomplish is if an apostle did this to it. Because at the end of the day, Mark's gospel is only as significant as Peter published it for him. That is why we see in a lot of the second century gospels the push to put apostles' names and eyewitnesses' names on them, because if you don't have eyewitness names on them, you lose authenticity. You lose credibility with the audience. You can't sell it without an eyewitness name. So if Luke just published this account and he did not have an apostle go, hey, we're going to approve this, we're going to use this, to me, it would have been no different than the many that tried and failed, because the idea that it's in the aorist, it's almost as if they did it and it didn't work. I think it's aorist passive. I need to go back and look at that, but it's almost as if it didn't work. And since it didn't work, what made Luke's work? The many didn't, but his did. The only thing that would make his circulate in churches is if an apostle approved it. And so I think that Paul didn't write it. I don't think he wrote Acts. I think he gave permission to Luke to do it and accumulate it so that he could have an account, so that Paul didn't have to boggle down his time doing that stuff. He was more interested in the churches that were struggling with persecution, or they were struggling with sin, like the Corinthian church, or legalism in Galatians. So I think that's probably the way that would have gone in my perspective.
So you think Luke in Acts was dictation from Paul and maybe some others?
No, free. He'd have been free. Mark would have been the only guy dictation. I think he wrote. It says Papias said that he was careful to write everything. No, it wasn't Papias. I'm sorry. It was said that he was careful to write everything that he was told. He didn't add to or take away. Actually,
was it Papias or Polycarpus? I didn't write everything down in order, but he adjusted everything to the needs at hand.
It's definitely Papias here. For he had not heard the Lord nor followed him, but later on followed Peter, who used to give teaching necessary, demanded, not making, as it were, an arrangement of the Lord's oracles. So Mark did nothing wrong, and thus writing down single points as he remembered them. For the one thing he gave attention to was not to leave out anything from what he heard, and made no false statement in them. So basically dictation. He's writing under dictation. Luke would have been free. He'd have been free. So what it probably would have looked like is Paul was an editor, not a writer. So Paul would have been able to say, hey, Luke, I think you should make sure you include this story for your narrative. Luke, I think you should remove this section from your narrative. Whatever it was, he would have had to have been an editor more than a writer.
But when you compare the accounts in Luke to John, or to Paul's letters, like I said in the video, they're very different.
Which are
like Paul, when you compare the accounts of Paul's deeds in Acts,
okay,
they're very different than Paul's own accounts. Paul is not. I know that the common explanation is like Acts has Paul performing miracles and everything. Paul himself does not say he doesn't have the common apologetic is he was not. His audience was already familiar with these things, so he didn't want that. He didn't want to. There was no point bringing them up. But Paul brags about himself a lot. He's like, I was shipwrecked. I was beaten more than you guys were. I was imprisoned more than you guys were. I was the Jew of Jews, the Pharisee of Pharisees, blah, blah, blah. Like, Paul brags about himself a lot to his audience. So it would be weird, given his writing style, that he would just have performed all these miracles, but just not mention them. See what I mean?
Yeah, I think that when Paul, like for example, you mentioned his shipwrecks and he was beaten with he was beaten, wrongly beaten. He talks about in his letters. Those do consist of parallel with Acts that tells you the entire narratives of those false accusations, lied about, beaten, shipwrecked, etc. So those parts to me are consistent with Acts. The part about his testimony, see, I think that we do the same thing in Christianity that Paul didn't do. When we talk about Christians are really big on that moment, like there I was, and you probably had an experience like this. You went down an altar,
the anecdotal.
I mean, it said this prayer, you felt something.
Yep.
I'm not against the moment, but and bless your heart if you're a Christian and you're listening to this, and every time somebody asks you if you're a believer, you have to tell them your whole story of salvation. Like, bless your heart. Like, I don't belittle what the Lord may have done to you, but here's how, when somebody says, Stephen, tell me about your story. Tell me how you came into Christianity. I basically just say I grew up in a Christian home, and after a certain age, I began to realize my need for Christ, and Christ became the Lord of my life. Boom. I don't tell the longevity of how I struggled with certain things, and that there was this sermon one time, the Lord really just gripped me, and then I felt questions come up, and I felt I was under conviction, and I don't go through all that.
It's always kind of a competition with those stories,
right?
Like,
who has the greater dramatic salvation story?
Exactly.
Now, I think when Paul viewed himself, he said, "I'm the chief of sinners." Also, when Paul got saved, I still believe that he was slightly embarrassed about his previous lifestyle. He did say, "Forgets the things which are behind, and he presses forward." But I mean, when Paul had his conversion, he wasn't a good guy. He wasn't on his way to do the Lord's work and start a new church in Damascus. He was on his way to imprison, had already had Christians like Stephen put to death. There's no way that he looks at his conversion story and wants to only celebrate the good that came from it. Like, there is a part of that where there's sober remorse about the event that led to that point. So to me, I think that what Paul's doing in his epistles, when he's talking about his conversion, is the Lord revealed himself to me and I became a follower of his. Something definitely drastically happened to the man Paul. He went from he even mentions in his epistles, he persecuted the church.
I agree with that.
So something radical had to have happened to him for him to just, he says the Lord revealed himself to him. So when you see the disciples, he's going to get these disciples in Damascus, bring them back to Jerusalem to trial, knocked off his horse, etc. To me, that would be something drastic enough of a revelation to make me go from one belief system and completely change to another that quickly. So I don't see that being necessarily a contradiction, as much as Paul's not just going to, and not only that, Paul had probably, these churches that he started, almost all of them he had visited except for the Romans. He pretty much said, when I was with you, I told you these things. So he probably told his testimony without Acts to the church many a time when he had started them and spent years. We know with the Ephesians, he spent well over a year with the Ephesians. You got to believe at some point he told them what happened. So maybe there's an assumption of knowledge that they know the story, and Paul is not needing to repeat all that just from that perspective. It's like, hey guys, the Lord revealed himself to me, and therefore this is why I do what I do.
But in Acts, his conversion story is told 3 times.
Yes.
The third time, the third time is actually claiming that Paul is speaking directly to the King Agrippa.
Yes.
And it's very different from the other two accounts. But even that one is still very different from his own accounts and his own letters.
And the manuscripts try to harmonize them in a couple places because the idea of kicking against the pricks, that's not in the first one. It's in it's at the
Agamemnon.
It's at the end. But some of the manuscripts have put it into the first conversion story too to harmonize. So that's how you kind of can tell. It's like, okay, some scribe didn't like the differences here, so they just included it in the first narrative. Now I'll go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
So I was doing a deep dive into P66 today because I have a book on it. All
right, and he's going to read it for us, folks. No,
it's just like the paleographers are like, yeah, he made a harmonization attempts here in order to harmonize John whatever with Matthew whatever. Like the scribe, like he changed things. Like they can tell that.
The scribes did that a lot, especially in the Gospels. Like,
dude, I missed my calling as a paleographer. It sounds like a very cool, the most boring but cool job at the same time.
So my friend Elijah Hickson, he wrote a book with Peter Gurry called "Myths and Mistakes of New Testament Textual Criticism." You may have heard of it. It's pretty popular book, textual criticism, and he loves the paleography stuff. It's like, man, that's you. Like, because when I did my dissertation on Codex H, for example, the scribe of Codex H used shorthand, which tells you the timeline of the manuscript, even though he dates it at the very end. It's like, that's helpful. Thank you for dating that. But I didn't need that date to be there to see, because they would never finish writing a word out to save space. I hate that. I think God did it to me on purpose. He knew before I went into that I hated that type of handwriting in that era, the 11th century, 12th century manuscript stuff. And when my dean had said, "Hey, man, I think you should investigate this manuscript in Jerusalem, and I think you should consider it." He said, "You should consider taking all of the New Testament citations from these fathers, First Clement, Second Clement, Didache, Epistles of Ignatius, and compare them to our Greek manuscripts, both in the Byzantine family and the critical text editions, and then take the Septuagint with the Old Testament quotes and compare them."
That's a wild ride right there.
Oh man, if you want, I'll send you my research on it. I have.
No, I've done similar things. That's what I'm saying. I know, like,
it's nuts. But I was like, okay, yeah, that sounds great. I was like, but I didn't know what year this manuscript was. I didn't know anything about Codex H, and I agreed to do it. And then I get these transcripts of it, and it's in the one style of handwriting I absolutely hate. I'm like, oh, he shorthands everything to fit. And so I had to do so much work. It took twice the amount of time that would have if I'd have done any other era. But all that to say, you see that these manuscripts do.
For those who are watching,
there were scribes that harmonize.
Scribes will take words that are used very commonly in the Greek text, like theos or theon for the word for God.
Theon.
They will abbreviate it to just be like thin, like THN. Like we would
just TN. Yeah. They didn't.
TN.
Yeah.
It was because it's common, like all the very frequently used words. Yeah, they would just buckle it down
that's
to
the nomina.
Because there was no standard real spelling at the time.
Yeah, they were trying to mimic the Hebrew nomina. They were trying to mimic the Hebrew nomina sacra, the sacred names of God. So Jesus, Iesu, or Christos, or whatever, they would condense it to the first letter and the last letter of the word to make it shorter, and then they would underline, trying to mimic the Hebrew. And so it's kind of funny as the scribal eras go on, they started nomina sacra words that were not in the earlier manuscripts too, like the cities and names of Jesus as descriptions in addition to his actual names. So they kind of went out of hand with that after a while. But when you're talking about these harmonizations, it happens all the time. Luke 17:36 is a perfect example to where even the King James translators were like, yeah, I don't think this is in most manuscripts and belongs here. And they put that in the original 1611. And that is where Jesus is teaching the story about people working in a field. One's taken a judgment, the other's left behind. And it includes the whole narrative.
That's right.
Includes the whole entire verse from Matthew and puts it in Luke. And it's clear the scribe was trying to harmonize there. So it's kind of easy to pick up on some of the harmonizations there. But you see that in Acts too, with the story of Paul's conversion. But I will say this, and maybe you would be a different personality. When people do ask me, tell me how you came to be a follower of Jesus, not just like, tell me if you are, like, tell me how it happened. There are sometimes when I'm telling the story, I focus on one specific individual that was an impact in my life, or something my dad had said, or a certain thing I didn't sleep well with at night. And then there's certain audiences where I'm speaking to, like when for example, if I'm asked to give my salvation testimony to a youth group versus a conference of mostly adults and a bunch of people that are coming to hear me, if you recorded my testimony to the youth group and my testimony to the conference of adults,
it's going to be a little bit different.
You would think that it's like, man, he didn't say that to the teenagers. That was an important deal or something like that. I would definitely focus on different things. And I think that Luke possibly recording that story there at the beginning was just telling how it actually happened, not from Paul's perspective, but from the narrator. Whereas at the very end, it's Paul, he's recording Paul's statement to King Agrippa. And it's Paul telling it from his perspective. Whereas Luke may have had a big picture of Paul's statement and only condensed a version of it to tell how it happened. Paul focused on Agrippa being, that's his audience at this point. That's my audience, King Agrippa. I want to focus on these elements.
Still talking about the end of Acts, right?
Right, at the end of Acts, right.
Okay.
So I think there's possibilities. There's Kip Davis says, oh, wow, you guys are live. And if he would have checked his feed, but if he would have checked his feed, I gave him the link in Twitter Messenger before we jumped on, but I won't be too hard on him.
He's off doing scholarly things, I'm sure.
He's reading some Hebrew manuscripts from the Dead
like
Sea.
actual, like real life shit.
Real stuff. Well, he's coming on next Monday to talk about the Isaiah scroll here with me. So, nice. Christians are going to kick me out before this is over if I just keep bringing all these other people in. But my point is, I think there's what's that?
Yeah. So you don't want to rub elbows with us nasty atheist types.
Yeah, well, I mean, we are humans and we got to do life together. So,
exactly.
Look, people say, well, I thought you were a Christian. Well, I am, but I'm not mad about it. I mean, like, come on, like, I'm not mad at I'm a Christian, and I'm not mad at other people that aren't. I have come to realize that everybody has a story. Speaking of Paul's story, we all have one. You have one. I have one. If I could twist you in a headlock and make you do what I want you to do, I'd put you in Christianity and say, come back. I'd do the same thing for Kip. But I realize that you guys have your journey and you have your reasons for what you do. I don't agree with them. You don't agree with mine, but
it's because you're wrong. But yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I know. That's what I keep getting told. But at the end of the day, this is real talk though. Like, Christianity believes that if we're to love our enemies and we're to love those that do evil toward us, how much more should we be toward people who oppose our views, but don't hate us necessarily? Like, I don't get the impression when we've talked on the side, like, man, I hate that guy's guts. He's, I wish he was dead, and if I had an opportunity to do it, I'd do it myself. Kind of situation. Like,
you didn't think I felt that way about you? Oh, you.
Well, I mean, it's possible. I mean, I'll leave anything open to possibility. You did accept a friend request on Facebook. I mean, that's a start. I mean,
that's true. That's because I wanted to come and talk.
You sent me one. You sent me one in a message, and I accepted it. So clearly, I thought, well, if you sent me a message and a Facebook request,
because Dr. Kill told me you wanted to connect. So.
Well, then let's blame Kip, because at the end of the day,
Dr. Kip was like, "Hey, here's a guy you can probably go take out soon."
Yeah, I mean, and he tricked us into this conversation. So it's really him to blame. And then I had the nerve to invite him on my show right afterward. But I think we all have our story. And I don't ever, you're, in my opinion, you are an image bearer of God. You may not believe that anymore, but I believe you are part of the Imago Dei. For me to look at a creation, yeah, for you to be an image bearer of God, you're created in God's image. For me to look at you as a lesser human or a lesser, like I'm going to treat you different than I would treat my neighbor over here that's a Christian that lives across the street from me or something like that. That's an unfair. And it's like when Christians have that mentality, I sit there and go, what Bible are you reading? I mean, great, defend the Bible, but live it too. Come on. Like, let's stay with the program. So no, I don't have a problem. I realize you have a story, you have a narrative. And I don't ever want to belittle that narrative. I would also venture to say, to compare you to Paul, when you tell your story, it's probably different to different audiences too. Am I wrong? You don't have to agree with Paul to agree with that.
No, I would say, yeah, you're right. If I genuinely thought that, but no, I think I try to keep my story pretty consistent. Because when I tell my story, I'm not really playing to a certain audience. I'm telling it on the internet, just like I am here. I don't know who's watching. Are you a teenager? Are you 89 years old? I don't know. So
could be.
I just tell my story. I told my story at the American Atheist Convention last year in front of a live crowd.
Wow.
I think it was pretty. Yeah, I'm giving another speech this year, next month.
Wow, do they pay you for that too?
No, they reimbursed me for my travels and
that's good.
And they gave me a food stipend allowance type thing.
That's courteous at least. I'm glad they did that.
Yeah. It's
so let's kind of like bring this to a conclusion. So you have your issues with the Gospels. I have my perspective of the Gospels. It's clear. I've spent a lot of years in the Gospels over the last 10, and I've actually, I don't know if you knew this about me. I spent most of my time in my classwork doing Gnostic Gospels, not canonical Gospels. Really? I have my own translation. Yeah, I have my own translation of the Gospel of Peter. And I have a 22,300 and something word research on the Gospel of Thomas. I have a writing on the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Truth, Peter's a letter to Philip. I've got all kinds of stuff out there. Most of my work was actually to study not the canonical, and that's actually what interested me in the program that I did. Is they're like, oh, let's do canon. And I'm thinking, oh, that's great. And then it was like, actually, what I want you to do is spend half your time studying non-canon and the other half studying canon. And I wasn't for that at first, but then once I started, I fell in love with reading extra biblical narratives. Even though I believe they were all forgeries, I fell in love with the idea that I didn't know they existed. It was that whole new world for me again. Yeah. So I had a blast. I had an absolute blast studying those. But when I dealt with the canon of Scripture itself, looking at the Gospels, looking at the Gnostic Gospels and comparing, these are the conclusions that I've come to. They're, not the same as Bauckham, or they're not the same as, Bird or anybody else. I mean, I've gleaned from them. I've taken things from Bauckham that I think are well stated. I've taken things from Bird that I think are well stated. I've taken things from Blomberg and all these other guys. I mean, and I haven't found anybody who has the same exact view as me. I just haven't, and I'm fine with that. I might come to the same conclusions about. I think they're based on eyewitnesses, but how I get there is not reading a script from another guy. I've actually had to learn to write a script of what I believe from the evidence to get to that point, and give my reasons. So I appreciate you coming on and letting me share some of these things, and then clarifying what you didn't mean on your program. And again, I apologize for misrepresenting the P66 thing.
Likewise. And if I did that at all,
I don't know. I mean, maybe
it happens.
But kind of talking about, in conclusion, the apologetics nature of things. Like,
Sure.
your view of apologetics, and I told you I teach 2 high school classes. So one of the things that was in your description of your video was scholars versus apologists or something like that.
Yeah.
For clarity's sake, for my
Mhm.
sanity, uh, do you believe that scholars and apologists can be scholars?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Okay. I had
Um,
a guy tell me that they couldn't the other day, and it made me mad. But go ahead.
yeah, they're wrong. Yeah, like you listen to like guys like Mike Lacona. He's a Christian, disagrees with Bart Ehrman on a lot of things, but he knows his stuff. He's a scholar. He's written many
Yeah.
books. He's in the field. Like, yeah. When I say like, I don't know, it's hard to you. The title of apologist is a title that you can just kind of give yourself. Like we were kind of talking about this a little bit backstage, right?
Sure.
You get a YouTube channel, you read some stuff, and you regurgitate what you just read and on a camera, and that's it. You're an apologist. And that puts a bad name on people like you. I would consider an actual scholar who does the actual work, who actually looks at the text, who studies the Greek, who goes to different seminars and all these different conferences to try and has these conversations, try and exchange ideas. Like, you're in it. You're not just, like I said, regurgitating what you read somebody else say. Because that's what I try to do.
Sure.
I'm not just going to come in here and quote Bart Ehrman on you. I study the Greek on my own.
Sure. So your biggest contention with apologists would not so much the idea of having an apologist as much as what apologetics has become.
Well, yes and no.
Okay.
I think the role of the apologist, okay, and I think it was Dan McClellan that said this best, is to treat data like it's an obstacle that needs to be overcome. That's what, like, you every argument I present, and we're just talking about the Gospels, right? We're not even talking about the failed prophecies. We're not talking about the historic inaccuracies. We're not talking about the scientific inaccuracies. We're not talking about the philosophical, moral dilemmas. We haven't gone into any of that. The goal of the apologist is to explain to people, or explain God to people, because God didn't explain himself well enough. I noticed this today. I don't know how I ever missed it. I don't keep bringing up P66, but the very corner of the first page of P66 is ripped off. The two words that are missing is God. God, or theos, or theon, and theon are missing because this corner is torn off. God was not even able to preserve his own name in the earliest manuscript that we have that should have it. So how is anybody expected to dedicate their entire life to such a sketchy position? If God wanted us to know that he was real, he would make it happen. It doesn't matter to me if the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses or not. We have thousands of eyewitness testimonies to Bigfoot. Do I believe them? No. So if the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses, I would have no problem saying that. Cool. Again, I think a lot of the things that Jesus said did come from a root oral tradition that stemmed from his disciples. But ultimately, that doesn't matter. Yeah.
Okay, so with the apologetic idea, so kind of give you we are an apologetics ministry at Explain. Well, we came out of Explain. We are Explore. Explain International is in Asia. It's in Malaysia, Fiji, Philippines. It's predominantly in that area. We helped start that, and then we are more stateside, Explore Christianity. Here's our perspective of apologetics. So just so you understand kind of like where we are as a group.
Sure.
I don't like, and John Beasley, he's the other co-founder of of this group, and Kip knows him because he and I did a 2-on-2 with him and Dr. Bowen on slavery, and we do not like the term apologetics. We don't like the term apologist.
I gathered as much.
Yeah, we usually don't even use it, but we use it because we have to make explanation from it. Like, so what are you doing? Well, we are doing apologetics, but like, so we say it for clarification, but we don't care for the term. One, we think it's used and abused, but two, there is a side of apologetics that we do agree with, because the word apologia is just, I mean, it's 1 Peter 3. Yeah, it's a defense. And it wasn't just a Christian thing. I mean, Paul using the idea of apologia was from actually Roman courtrooms, in Greek courtrooms, a defense against a plaintiff, defending one's position. Paul talked about it. Peter talked about it. Paul didn't always use that word, but Peter used that word specifically. Jude kind of gives a connotation of it, and Jude contending for the faith. I don't think that we don't necessarily think that God needs us. When I look at Christianity, and I look at getting the gospel out or standing true to the test of faith or whatever situation is, I never look at it from the perspective of, if I don't do this, nobody else will. God needs me. I don't look at, because I believe God is sovereign. I believe that God can do whatever he wants. I believe that he could come out and say whatever he wants, do whatever he wants, prove whatever he wants, and he doesn't need me to do it. For me to think that God needs me to do something is to think too highly of myself. But I think when I look at Christianity, from my perspective, is that God has called me into a community of grace, a covenant community, to restore what was lost at the fall. And that is God and man doing life together in the universe that God created, and man gets to coexist in that world with God and do life with him because God wants to do that. Not because God has to have me, but because God wants me to do things with him. And so when I look at whatever niche of apologetics that somebody does, like for me, I'm not a scientist. I'm not the son of a scientist. My work is in text and canon, mostly early church fathers. What I do is I don't think like, man, I've got to put something out on Luke, because if I don't do it, then Luke will never be defended. And I just don't think I'm that special. I mean, people have been defending the Gospel of Luke thousands of years before I've ever been thought of. But when I look at it as a journey of me, number one, getting to know God more, the authors of Scripture more, and seeing God use both. And it's a journey for me. And I'm actually just on this journey sharing what's been revealed to me through study, through thought, through God giving me wisdom to put 2 and 2 together. And it is sharing what my journey in this academic training has been with those who have not been on that journey. I don't see myself as special, or like I'm out here, we think apologetics, we think, we're coming out swinging, and people do.
A lot of apologists do, though.
Yeah, that's true. But you got to admit, so do atheists. We've talked about, I mean, there's some bulldogs. But everybody's doing some apologetic. I mean, I think I was messaging, I think it was Dr. Kip Davis. I was messaging him. I was like, to a level, even atheists are apologists to a level, not of the Christian faith, but they're defending their findings, their research, their perspective. Yeah. We're all doing apologetics. I think what you and I disagree, that's not where we disagree. Where you and I struggle on the most is the term apologist. What is an apologist, right? Yeah. Well, there is no function of an apologist in the New Testament scriptures. It was the prophets, Christ the cornerstone, built upon the prophets, the apostles. Then he gave elders and pastors and leaders.
It wasn't until the early church fathers, and most of those were Greek philosophers who converted.
Very much.
Until Rome was conquered, and then the apologetics kind of stopped. Weird.
Yeah, and they were defending very different. They were defending against Marcion. They were defending against these corruptions that were coming in. Gnostics were coming in. I mean, that was a big deal for Irenaeus, naturally. Valentinus, etc. I mean, these things were becoming problematic, so they had to deal with them. So when we're talking about the apologist, like what is an apologist? Well, it's not a church role. It's not an ordained instituted position in the church. To me, what it is it is a function, because if you read 1 Peter 3 carefully, and John preached at a conference, Jonathan Beasley, the other co-founder, he preached on 1 Peter 3, and he showed that every Christian is called to know what they believe and why they believe it and be able to explain it. The idea of an apologist, every Christian is actually called to know what they believe. Because, I mean, how would that be even in an atheistic or a skeptic circle where it's like, I'm an atheist, but I don't know why. I believe these things or don't believe these things, but I don't know why I do or do not believe those things. We wouldn't take that person serious. But yet, Christianity,
it used to be in the early days of Christianity that a creed was all you needed. Just recite this creed. This is what you believe, right? That's all they needed. And when you read the Bible, God leads the Israelites with a pillar of fire. That's pretty obvious. Hard to deny that thing. Jesus invites doubting Thomas to touch the holes in his hands. Cool. And then you'll watch like a debate with a Christian apologist, and they'll say like there's evidence for the existence of God in like quantum wave fluctuation. Really? The Israelites got a pillar of fire, but I have to research quantum wave fluctuation to find him? Okay. So clearly in the Bible, God is interacting with those characters much different than he's interacting with us today. I think it's because the biblical authors thought he was real, and there's not evidence that he is now.
So when you get to the apologist there, like, would you expect an apologist to defend the existence of God, for example? Like you wouldn't fault them for coming out and saying, here's my whatever reasons as to why I believe. No. Like you wouldn't fault apologists for having a stance of faith and producing the evidence they believe that there is in science or etc. to defend that. Like you wouldn't fault them for that, right?
No, but the thing is, biblically, God equipped the disciples with the ability to perform miracles, right? And he empowered them for the ministry. Go. And then you again in Acts, they go cast out demons, they resurrect people from the dead, they heal people, they do all these miracles, and that's how they convert people according to Acts. They didn't need apologetics. God gave them the ability to perform miracles. And then that just kind of goes away, I guess. I'm familiar with all the theology.
Depends. There's different. Yeah, there's cessationists.
Yeah, I know all the explanations. Yeah. But at some point, if you believe the Gospels are true and the New Testament is true, at some point you have to believe that God withdrew the Holy Spirit, or at least the empowerment of the Holy Spirit to perform miracles, and thought that something else would be adequate enough to take its place.
Yeah, and that goes, and the Christians fight about that one all the time. Are you continuous or cessationist? Yeah.
There's been continuous cessationism. Yeah, there's been huge church splits over this throughout the.
Oh, it still is. Is. There are reports of miracles, healings, and stuff, and I know that I know Testify, Eric Visa watching, he's produced some stuff on that with Jonathan McClatchy as well. And I have not investigated what they've investigated, so I really can't speak intelligently to some of the stuff.
What? Let me say something real quick while you're on the topic. Sure. In regard to like the miracle claims, because we got the Asbury revival going on right now, right? Because my denomination came out of the Azusa Street revival, the Assemblies of God. There's guys like him and Smith Wigglesworth and Ryan Hart Bonnke and a bunch of others, and there's all these like stories about all these revivals and these miracles that people say they had their limbs grow off. I had one of my professors told me he saw somebody have a tumor fall off of his head. And this was before the age of cell phones. And now we have a live stream of the Asbury revival. No, weird that there's no miracles. Now that the cameras are on, there's none of these things happening. If somebody's arm grew back on camera, that would be everywhere. But there isn't. So
are there claims about that at the Asbury?
No, there's not. That's the weird. Because having studied all these other past revivals, that's what's common throughout all of them. There's all these miracles that happen during them. There's stories about Smith Wigglesworth raising people from the dead, Reinhard Bonnke as well. There's a story about like these guys like threw their dead friend over a fence, and then when he hit the ground, he was brought back to life. Weird. Like that was a story that was told in my church. You have these crazy stories about these revivals, and now you have one that's streamed live, and nothing's happening. Do the cameras like inhibit the Holy Spirit's powers, or were all those other stories that we had heard made up? You know, like why is God not performing these miracles now that we have cameras to record them?
So when it comes to a lot of miracles side of things, like when Jesus said, "Greater works than these will you do when the Comforter comes," I actually, at that same conference I was telling you, John Beasley preached on 1 Peter 3 on the apologetic. I gave my presentation on how we have actually misused John 14 to apply to us when almost everything Jesus said in that passage was explicitly to his apostles. His apostles having the ability to do things was contingent upon the Spirit giving them the power to do greater things than what Jesus was going to do. Specifically in that passage, he was talking to his followers, his leaders. And we even see places where like Paul does all these miracles at times or in Acts is expressed. And then there's times when he doesn't. Like he just doesn't. He leaves people sick. He leaves people without healing. And again, I know we disagree on the pastorals, but here's Timothy who has a stomach problem. What's Paul's solution? Well, he didn't wave his hand over and heal him. He was like, man, stop drinking water, because apparently the water was contaminated. He was drinking. Drink a little wine for your stomach. Why didn't he just do some miracle prayer right there too? So I think that I don't think healings were like something where anytime an apostle walked by, something supernatural had to happen. I think they were designated to particular times in the New Testament where the apostles were under certain movement of the Spirit to do something for a specific people at a specific time and place. And they were doing them when those events were made evident by God himself, because there's places where the apostles don't do miracles when they could have, just like Jesus. I mean, Jesus didn't heal every single person he walked by.
What do you make of the story of the woman that I think the woman who had the issue of blood, and she touched Jesus' robe, and Jesus was like, who touched me? I felt power flow from me. Who touched me? Oh, it was you. So how do you explain that one away?
Well, he told her it was her faith that did it. Are you asking me how like physically that would happen? Or are you asking me, do I believe that was an actual report?
Either one. Do you think that's an actual?
I think it's viable. I mean, if Jesus was doing other miracles, including ones that his own adversaries were acknowledging, like Nicodemus, for example, comes and says, "Look, we know you're from God. Nobody could do these things unless God be with them." So even his critics had an acknowledgement that he was doing things that were not normal enough. And this is something that people have to deal with on the other end of the spectrum, is like, what would have caused the nation of Israel and its leaders to want to put this guy to death? Like, what was he doing? I mean, yes, there could be the argument that he was starting a cult movement. But they were even saying when he cast out demons, well, he's doing it in the name of Beelzebub.
Yeah.
So I think the fact that Jesus, I think it is very plausible, just from his adversaries, just from the accounts of the eyewitnesses, that miracles were happening. Something changed the world when Jesus of Nazareth was on the earth. enough to where a whole movement was started by him. Writings are written of him. Statements are quoted of him. Reports of his miracles are rampant. Something supernatural, in my opinion, what happened when this Jesus of Nazareth was on earth. And so the idea that a woman who had the issue of blood, who went to multiple doctors and they couldn't help her, would grab onto the hem of his garment, and her believing that that man was who he was could heal her. I don't find that hard to believe, given that he did bigger miracles than that, raising the dead, healing people off their sick bed.
I was just bringing that up as a challenge to you, saying that like the miracles are meant for a specific like time and place or period for.
Oh, sure. Well, yeah. I mean, here's something to think about in that scene. Okay, so maybe I understand. Jesus got bumped a lot in that crowd. Because even Peter was like, Jesus, like, I don't know why you're asking this question. I mean, you're being pressed by everybody in the crowd here. Of course, people are touching you.
Yeah. There's
multiple people in that crowd that probably have back pain, sore ankles, bad hearing, poor eyesight, balding on top. I mean, there's probably a lot of people in that crowd that rammed into Jesus, who had physical infirmities. Just take any crowd.
Most people at the time were dying of like tooth decay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They didn't have the dental work that we do. Yeah. I mean, visionary work. Paul complained about his eyes. I mean, none of those people bumping into Jesus, touching him, created this power, if you would, to come out and heal. So what was the difference? You know, there's a situation where Jesus didn't just heal everybody that touched him. There were people that wanted him to heal them. And even it says early on in his earthly ministry, there was a lot of people that were demon possessed and had many, many sicknesses in his hometown. But because of unbelief, he abandoned the town and did not heal any of them.
Because they were like, this guy's the Messiah? Really?
We saw this kid grow up.
This guy built my fence. Okay. And okay. Sure,
not him. Sure. Yeah. They clearly did not believe. They were ready to throw him off a cliff before it was over with. But when you think about it, there are scenarios even where Jesus does this extraordinary miracle. And I think that's the point of most of Luke's Gospels. He focuses on Jesus.
Weird because he performs so many miracles in front of non-believers. You know, in Matthew, the graves open up and people get up and walk around. The ground splits open in a great earthquake. The sun stops, or the earth stops rotating. There's all these things that non-believers will see.
Yeah, and then that's the thing, like from a lot of the Lucan perspective, I think that's the appeal, is that he's showing that Jesus actually goes after these undesirable, unclean outcasts. He goes after the lame and the maimed and the blind, and it's not, Jesus was like the most not so Messiah you would ever want kind of figure. Like the Jews didn't want that kind of Messiah, where he's speaking well Samaritans. He tells a parable. I mean, it was the greatest insult in all the world for Luke to report the story of Jesus and the Good Samaritan. A Levite and a priest walk by this man and don't perform the greatest law of loving your neighbor. But a Samaritan does. I mean, that's a slap in the face. And then Luke goes into the stories about this rich man who is a son of Abraham. He dies. And there's this beggar at his gate named Lazarus. And Lazarus is going back to Eleazar, which was Jesus using the analogy of Abraham and his servant. Remember in the book of Genesis, before he was given Isaac, he thought he was going to be blessing his servant's son, Eleazar.
Yep.
So here's Jesus using a Gentile name, this unknown name, who's a son of Abraham. You have Lazarus resting in the bosom of a patriarch and a son of Abraham cast out of the kingdom. That's not the way that's supposed to go. Like, it's supposed to be the Jew resting with Abraham, and it's supposed to be the outcast who is separated from there. And then Jesus in Luke's gospel does the same thing, not just with that parable, but he says there are going to be many people from the east and the west and the north and the south who are going to be reclined at the table with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the prophets. But many of you, these Jews, are going to be cast out where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, you're telling Jews are not going to be in the kingdom with the patriarchs and prophets, but Gentiles are going to be in there? It's like, yeah. So you do see, I would say more so in Luke's account, where there's this appeal to show that Jesus was not coming to an elect group. He wasn't coming just to heal Jews. He wasn't coming just to save Jews. He wasn't coming just to perform miracles for Jews. In fact, he purposely hid miracles from Jews at times because of their disposition. So I think there's an intriguing conversation on Luke's emphasis of the outcast over against Matthew, which is predominantly he was ministering to the Jews.
Yeah, I think Luke was pretty anti the Jews. There's several different reasons. We don't have to go into detail, but one of the big ones is his depiction of Pilate saying multiple times. I think in like Matthew, he says once, "Are you sure you want me to crucify this guy? Really?" And in Luke, he says it like 3 times. Okay, how about I'll flog him first? Okay, is that good enough? Okay, he's flogged. Oh, you still want him crucified? Are you sure? Okay, well, I'm going to wash my hands because I don't want any part of this. That was not Pilate. Pilate was impeached by the king for how badly he treated the Jews. He killed them all the time. He ransacked their temples, stole their land, their property, everything. He didn't care about the Jews.
Yeah,
right. So for Luke to come around and be like, yeah, and depict Pilate as being like this guy who's like sheepish, like, oh, I don't want to. That's his way of saying the Romans were not to blame here. It was the Jews, and they place emphasis. The Jews were in the crowd. The Pharisees were screaming, "Free Barabbas, crucify him." Yeah. So yeah, I think Luke is purposefully demonizing the Jews and trying to make the Romans more innocent.
But to me, and that goes to Luke's audience is Gentiles, and if he is actually producing a gospel for Paul to be traveled to his Gentile endeavors and his locations, if he's writing a gospel to the Gentiles, the emphasis would be to show that Jesus was reaching out to the Gentiles in his ministry and intended on welcoming them into his kingdom. That would make sense. And not only that, I mean, according to what we have of Luke, he was Antiochian. So he wouldn't have been a Jew himself. He would have been more Greek or perhaps Assyrian, or Syrian, not Assyrian, Syrian. So yeah. Luke would have been a Gentile.
More on the Greek side, yeah.
He would have definitely been more emphasis of, he's one of those outcasts. I mean, he writing the gospel was not a Jew, a part of covenant Abraham. So him being welcomed into this would have been a major factor, I think, for him too, to open the eyes.
I don't know. I think it would have been fairly normal at the time, given that the Jews at the time were like 0.5% of the population even. And then Paul comes around, he opens up to the Gentiles, the remaining like 95% of the population we'll say. So like Paul won Gentile converts very, very quickly because the Jews were rejecting the claim or Jesus is Messiah. So by the time Luke is written, I think like the vast majority of Christian converts were Greek or Gentile.
No doubt. No doubt.
Yeah. You agree with that?
Yeah, we agree on that. Oh yeah, I think that's why, and that goes back to my view of Matthew. I think that's why they were forced to translate it at some point, because leaving the gospel in a Hebrew dialect is no good to anybody but that small sect. If you're going to send out a message to all the churches from the headquarters of the apostles, Jerusalem, Antioch, you need to have it in Greek, because what good is it to send a message out to anybody in Hebrew that doesn't know Hebrew or Aramaic for that matter? So it makes perfect sense. So kind of a way of wrapping it up, so back to the apologist.
We can talk forever.
Yeah, sure. And I'm enjoying our conversation. I hope you are as well. You know, the apologist, the we had explored do not overemphasize the term. And I agree with you. And I said this when I was with Testify and let's see, I was with Than, I was with Eric. I want to get their names right here because they all have channels, Inspiring Philosophy, all that. So all of them together. I even said it with all of them, and I'm pretty sure if I go back and watch the video, they were nodding their head. I could be wrong. They might have been in agreement with me on this. I said apologism, the apologist has become a fad, and I think a lot of people need to get out of it. I personally would love to get out of it. The terminology or even the function of it. I pastored 2 churches before I ever did this. I actually didn't want this side of things. I was the second church I was in. I was completely content with what I was doing. The Lord just interrupted my life and changed plans. And it was, all right, we're going to do a PhD instead. Okay. Well, that took me to where I was. I didn't go into go, man, I just want to be an apologist. I'm studying to be an apologist. I'm studying these things and now I'm creating content on my own. I'm creating thoughts. And it was like, hey, would you come on my channel? Kind of like you, like you start telling your story, people reach out. Next thing you know, you're talking here, you're at a conference like you were talking about. It's kind of like I wasn't looking for this. Like I didn't have a bone to pick with anybody. I didn't know who Richard Carrier was. So like when somebody asked me to debate Carrier, that wasn't my idea. When somebody asked me to debate Robert Price on the Gnostic Gospels, that wasn't my idea. I didn't even know who Robert Price was. I had to get a book, which was bigger than Baucham's, to even read Robert Price's position. And, I mean, he was great. He was a super nice guy to me. But like, I wasn't looking for a fight. I wasn't out there like, all right, I am going to be on the front lines of God and fight this. It's just kind of like, this is what I'm studying. This is what I'm learning. I'm going to share it with people. People were engaging in the content for better or for worse, invited for better or for worse on debate or discussion or panel or conference. And this is kind of how I got where I am. I didn't want this. I was comfortable as a pastor. I didn't want to be where I am today. But here I am. And so I think that if things are more organic and less forced, like you said, giving yourself a cool name and starting a podcast or whatever, great. But I think one of the things that Christianity lacks in their apologetics is original content. And what I mean by that is apologists have not thought for themselves. And some of that is twofold. One, they don't read broadly enough. Two, they have not gone through the academic training. And let me just back up here too. I had to do a lot of studying despite what I was trained. I want to say that like most schools that gave me a diploma would throw me out. Like, in fact, they would have revoked my diploma in a couple of schools already if they were legally allowed to do it. I know they would have. They've already asked for my ordination back in one camp. So, I mean, like, because I'm too liberal for them, apparently. So, it's not. Sometimes I had to educate despite education. But my point is I think a lot of these apologists have never had to go through the excruciating training of academia where you had to write a 20,000 word research paper on this. You had to investigate through 55 minimum sources to do that.
You can't just read a book or watch a YouTube video and then regurgitate the stuff you said. Like
right.
It's so much more to it than that. And that's what a lot of these guys are doing. Atheists included, by the way.
Atheists included. And
they're just as bad.
So they're fringe apologists or whatever. And most apologetics, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, there's some apologetics that are just designated to fighting against different views of how to do apologetics. So you have like presuppositional apologetics, classical apologetics, evidentialism apologetics. Mm-hmm. Some guys dedicate their whole time to arguing with other Christians about which form of apologetics is right. People ask me all the time, like, are you presuppositional? You sound like a presuppositionalist. Or when you gave that presentation in the Gospels, you sound like a real evidentialist. It's like, good. So you don't know what I am, which means I'm probably doing a combination of all of it. And I'm kind of like Paul. Paul says to the Jew, I became a Jew, to Greek became Greek. Yep. When I'm with the church, if I'm speaking to you, I'm going to be more of an evidentialist, for example. if I'm at a church, we all have commonality that we believe the same values of faith. They're going to think I'm a presuppositionalist because I'm starting with scripture. I'm assuming they believe scripture. I believe scripture. So I start from the scriptural standpoint. If I talk to an atheist, I'm not starting with what the Bible says about itself because they don't give a rip. We're going to start with Tertullian. We're going to start with P66. We're going to start with these other documents. We're going to start with the evidence and work our way in. So, but there's some apologists that have just dedicated their side to fighting Calvinism versus Arminianism, presuppositionalism versus evidentialism. It's like, that's not apologetics. That's just bickering.
And from the atheist perspective, it's like, can you have a stupider argument? Like, can you waste your time any harder with these kinds of arguments? Like, this is what you're spending your time with, grace versus
so that's
works,
your perspective of those things.
Yeah, from the atheist perspective, you're like, you guys go ride a bike or something, do something, pick up some trash on the ground. That would be, your time would be better served doing that than arguing Calvinism versus Arminianism or whatever. Yeah, that's that's usually the perspective we have.
I know there's a couple of pastors watching this who are probably writing up an announcement for Sunday. They're going to do National Pickup Trash. That's probably what's going to happen. Hey, listen, if we can get our communities to go around and pick litter up on the side of the roads, we'll probably do that.
Yeah,
anyway.
Do that.
But I just
pastors in the chat.
Go pick up trash.
Do something that's not a waste of everyone's time, please.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, I've been caught into these things, and I've debated the subject. I've been on programs, and I don't mind talking about them. Like, if a Christian wants to say, "Hey, why do you?" Because I'm more Reformed. I'd be more Calvinistic in my soteriology. People bring me on. They're like, "So why are you?" And I don't mind answering them, but I'm not going to sit there. And I've done those debates, and I'm done with them. I'm done doing those debates of, well, here's why I'm right about my perspective of Christianity. Now, I have done some good discussions there's progressive Christians. The Christian Post? I don't remember. One big article posted about this guy in Tennessee about how he's a progressive Christian and things like that. And I debated him. It was a friendly debate. But as a whole, I don't even really like to engage the pettiness in Christianity anymore. But it's certainly not apologetics either. From that perspective, I don't find that to do an apologetic work, but I think you and I would agree on the fact that in atheist circles and Christian circles, there's a new push because of the world we live in with the access of a fingertip of YouTube and TikTok to just speak one's mind, but not do the due diligence of processing, thinking, training of the material to familiarize yourself. Kind of like, I've been teaching my high schoolers this. Do not just take if there's a footnote, for example, somebody's quoting somebody and they're making a statement and they leave you a footnote like they're supposed to, or an endnote at the end of the chapter. Go look it up. Go see if they're using that properly. I don't care if they're Christian or an atheist. We all do it. Like, well, I've got sources. Well, let's talk about your sources, because are they saying what you're saying? Are they actually using the same context in which you're doing it? We just haven't done the due diligence. And I think that people just they just want a amen chamber sometimes, and they only appeal to a crowd that'll agree with them. They don't ever allow themselves to be tested. I know some Christians that will not allow themselves to be engaging another person of an opposite position. They're afraid to, or they think it's a waste of time. You're just wasting your time. You're not going to convince them, etc. It's like, yeah, but that's the problem we have in Christianity. I can't speak to the problems in atheism or skepticism. Christianity has that problem. We're too shallow. We're too shallow, and not everybody, like you said, there are good, solid guys that are doing the proper research out there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and to speak on the atheist community, there are a lot of people that have just deconstructed, and a lot of them are coming out of a place of hurt or trauma or pain, and that's perfectly valid. It's perfectly valid, but they channel that anger or whatever, and they go too hard with it. They haven't They haven't taken the time to relax, I guess, and deal with the trauma or the whatever they experience. They haven't really dealt with it. So they sometimes they'll take a negative outlet, and I can't speak for the whole community. I'm not the fucking sorry words. Try not to cuss. I cuss a lot. I've been doing really good up until now. I can't speak for the whole atheist community. I don't speak for the whole atheist community, but I think in some cases that is what happens.
So what do you think about the academic side of things? So, for example, I have 2 classes this semester. I had one last semester. I'm going back to one in next year. Dealing with the idea of apologetics. I know we've already disclosed how we feel about it.
Yeah.
But my goal as a teacher, and I love teaching high school. I've been able to teach some college courses at some universities periodically as an adjunct, but I've actually really enjoyed the 11th and 12th grade years. Those guys and girls have the big questions. They have they're kind of like, where do I go in life? What road do I go? This is what I was raised in. This is what I was told. I think that I have bursted the bubble of more Christians. These kids are probably traumatized by me because, like, I let them know that the wise men weren't at the major scene the other day when we were going through Matthew's gospel. They would have come, yeah, oh yeah. So there goes my nativity. It's over. I don't know what to believe anymore. Things like that. I mean, I'm one of those people that just takes emotionalism Christianity and pokes a hole in it. And I'm sure I could do better and be more emotional. My wife's probably watching this going, yeah, all right, get him. But when it comes to, I don't want to just follow something out of tradition. I don't want to just follow something out of emotion. So even though you probably don't like what I teach the high school age, I am presenting all the opinions that are out there and putting it up on screens and doing the comparisons, the contrast.
You're teaching apologetics. That's what you have to do. That's what my school did.
Sure.
Yeah, my school's the one that told me, like, hey, because I took apologetics in college, and they were like, these are some of the arguments you might face. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, the virgin birth. Like, these are some of the things and every follow-up point was like, here's how you explain that one away. They even talked about like the young Earth creationism versus old Earth creation. Talk about the gap theory and all that. Like so it's like they give you some options that you can choose from. Like, oh, I can just pick one of these, and So that I think a lot of times that's what happens with apologetic education. I don't know if that's what you do or not, but I imagine in some sense you kind of have to. Like I always tell them where I land. You're going to face out in the wild. Here's how you combat that.
Here's how I say, and my students will back me up when they watch this. I say, this is what I believe. This is where I conclude on this. This is my perspective. Now, if you end up believing everything that I believe, then you didn't do your due diligence. If you end up coming up with every single conclusion, every single thought that I have, then you're just repeating me.
Yeah.
And I don't want them to repeat me. I want them to think for themselves. I had she was a 10th grade girl. I had her write something about, and I think it was Luke. I think I posted about it on social media. And she took what I said.
I need a drink. 2 seconds. I'm still listening. Keep talking.
Oh, keep going. She took what I said and just expanded on it exponentially. And I was quite blown away at what she was able to do. What that encouraged me as a teacher is that she is thinking on her own. She is drawing her own conclusion from the evidence. She is writing about it herself. As far as like last semester, it's quite funny. The Epic of Gilgamesh, every single one of my students will tell you in that class that I asked them, what do almost all ancient civilizations have in common when it comes to narrative of Genesis 6? Tree of life, flood, giants that were formed from the gods. There's these commonality of all ancient civilizations. And I refuse to hide that from them. It's like, there are ancient statements older than the Bible about giants, flood, tree of life, because that's what the Epic of Gilgamesh is. He's searching for the tree of life. And lost it, of course, on his way up. But, you know,
tons of them.
So it's extraordinary for them to be able to be exposed to that. This stuff they never heard before. And to me, as a teacher, I feel like I fail them if I didn't, like, I failed them.
I hadn't heard of it until college.
Well, they got to hear it before college, so I'm excited. I get to be the first person for a lot of things.
26 at the time? No, not even. I don't know. I was in my early mid-20s.
Early 20s. Well, I didn't learn about the Epic of Gilgamesh until about, let's say I'm 33 now, probably about 25. That's probably about 25. Yeah. Probably been about 8 years. Nobody ever told me anything, but I think it's good to educate students. Every school is going to have a perspective. Every school is going to have a leaning. Every school is going to, even a secular college or a dean over a program is going to have a twist or a leaning or a final conclusion that's going to attract students into that way. Like if I go to the University of North Carolina, if I'm signing up for Bart Ehrman's class, I want Dr. Ehrman. And by the way, I've actually got to take courses from Ehrman's lectures. And my dean was unconventional on a lot of things.
I'm interviewing him next month again.
What's that?
So I'm interviewing him next month again.
He's a great scholar. He's a great, like,
anyway,
what's funny is he actually inspired me to study the early patristic. I didn't know who First Clement was in First Clement. I didn't know what the Epistle of Barnabas was. I didn't know any of that until I was forced to listen. Again, I had a dean that did things unconventional from the school, which is probably why he's not a teacher there anymore. Hey, I found these 12 lectures on the patristics from Bart Ehrman. I want you to write a report on all 12 lectures. Bart Ehrman, he's not on our side. What do you want me to do? What's up with that? Like, you know, so I did it. And it was amazing. I learned so much about the patristics from him. And I got to write a lot of research. And unfortunately, I've learned from the patristics to actually come to different conclusions from him. But it was his good teaching that inspired me to study the Didache, to study the Epistle of Barnabas. So I think that teaches us that we can all learn from each other. Christians can learn from scholars that don't land in Christianity. And I would like to believe that, you know, and I know that Kip, Dr. Davis is in the comments. He could tell you he was educated from things from mentors of his that were Christians.
Yeah.
We can all bring scholarship to the table, even if we have our different endings. And again, obviously we're in a private school that has an emphasis on Christianity. So obviously the conclusion is we're going to land with a Christian mindset, which will be my conclusion on teaching, but I'm not going to hide them from the academic literature out there that's against Christianity the way it was done to me. That's not fair.
It was done to me. My church was like, don't read any of the bad stuff. And then I get to college and they're like, read all the bad stuff. So
a bomb dropped on you.
Yeah, it was a little eye-opening.
I don't like being isolated. I want to know the truth.
I wasn't aware of.
Yeah, I want to know the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I don't want to be surprised. Like, that's in our history. What happened in Christianity in the 4th century? Like, I don't like being surprised with work like that. But so what in conclusion for this, where do you think in the realm of apologetics, training young, you said in your message that me teaching an apologetics class, was it, you said weirdly cool? What did you say? You said
you use my content to teach in your apologetics class. I was like, that's weirdly cool.
That's what it was. Yeah. So were you insulted that
cool, but I do.
I'll say, were you insulted that I did that?
No, I was like, that's cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I was like,
some of them liked your hair, by the way. Some of them complimented your hair. So they might not agree with you on Luke and John, but they did like your hair. So
that's
Yeah, we did watch your video, your response, and so forth, and they're going to watch this at some point, I would imagine. But it's good. It's good for them to be exposed to this. It's good for them to hear this. I think it'll make them think. It'll make them have to investigate. It'll make them have to go
If you
through.
want to get into apologetics, you're gonna encounter people like me.
You're going to have to deal with it,
Yeah.
and I'm glad for that. Well, man, I don't want to take any more of your time. I know it's late. We're getting on a 2.5 hour mark. Is there anything else that you would want to share with the audience here? It looks like there's a good blend. It looks like we got a mixed group. It's not just all Christians. So, anything that
friends in the chat, appreciate y'all.
You'd like to share with
I would just say. I didn't prepare a closing statement. You should have told me.
No. Just
I'm kidding. Don't be afraid to go where the data leads you or where the information leads you. Do the research, ask questions about the questions you just asked. Ask questions about the thing you just read, ask questions about the sources that what you just read came from. Ask all the questions. Don't take anything for face value. And when you come to a conclusion, it doesn't matter how you feel about it. Go with it. The data does not care about facts over feelings. I think data doesn't care about your feelings. If you want to, I think Matt Dillahunty says it best. I want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. I think everyone should have that goal. Do the research. If you come out the other side Christian, fine. Don't get elected to Congress and try to force me to pray every morning or something. Then we're going to have a problem. But otherwise, be a Christian. I was there. I didn't hate it that much. That'd be my message. Try to be as objective as possible. Try to check your own biases and do the work. Coming to a conclusion takes effort. It takes a lot more than a YouTube video or a book. Sometimes you got to learn another language. But if you're that passionate about finding out what is right and what's wrong, you have to put in the work. So do it and go with it.
I echo all that. I echo all that. I believe follow the data, follow the facts. That's why I call my podcast Facts. It's actually an acronym, but it's meant to be kind of catchy. But I agree. Follow the data and do the research. And it's amazing. People will land differently. But I agree with that 100%. Well, man, I appreciate you coming on and clarifying. There's a lot more profitable than a video against a video against a video against a video. It's like, okay, that'll never end. But I appreciate you. I appreciate you doing that, taking your time on a Monday. I know you have a family. We're all dealing with things there, and it's hard to find windows anymore. But I appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts and working through some of the content that we talked about. And I probably dumped a lot on you with my view of the Gospels too. And feel free to respond later to any of that or think through that, because I'm sure you're going to have to go back and fact check me on some things myself. And
Dr. Kip.
He's just a nice guy. I don't know why everybody says he's such a jerk. I mean, look at him. Just feel free to, hit me up anytime. We're friends on Facebook, and you got my messenger, and send me any questions, and I'll send you questions, and it'll be great.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, guys, we're going to head out.
Thanks. We'll have a good night. This is fun.
Yep. Have a great night, everybody. Thank you.